Hey guys, today we're diving into the legend of Zhong Kui, one of the most famous figures in Chinese mythology. If you've never heard his name, here's the short truth. Zhong Kui is China's great exorcist, a man who hunts demons, binds them in chains, and drags them before the courts of the underworld. In life, he was a scholar of unmatched brilliance who topped the imperial exams, but he was denied office because of his face. Humiliated, he took his own life. In death, he was appointed by King Yama as Marshal of the Nether Precincts, the Demon-Queller, commander of 10,000 spirits, protector of the living, terror of all evil. But to understand Zhong Kui, you first need to know the world he walks. In Chinese belief, the realms of the living and the realms of spirits aren't sealed off by unbreakable walls. They breathe against each other. Ghosts slip into markets and alleys. Plague gods wear human form and spread sickness through the streets. Fox spirits sneak into houses behind stolen faces. Even dreams can be broken into, stolen from within. To keep order, the cosmos has its own bureaucracy. Just as the Son of Heaven, or simply the Emperor, sits in his palace, the underworld too has its sovereign. At the throne of judgment sits King Yama, stern as iron law, his clerks recording every soul's account. At his side stand two figures every Chinese person would know: black and white impermanence, one dark, with a tall official's hat and a tongue that hangs past his chin; the other pale and gaunt, with brush and scroll in hand. Together they walk the borders of life and death. White impermanence tempts souls with promises of reward. Black impermanence binds them in chains. They are yin and yang in flesh, lure and capture, mercy and punishment, the two halves of death's inevitability. Their masks are still worn at festivals today, reminders that no one escapes the ledger of the underworld. Well, except for that monkey. Then come the bailiffs, Oxhead and Horseface, who drag the guilty before judgment. And above them all rides Zhong Kui, armed with sword, seal, and chain, free to strike wherever spirits break the law of heaven and earth. His legend begins in the Tang dynasty. Emperor Xuanzong fell into fever, and in his dream, demons swarmed his chamber, even stealing the pouch at his waist. Then a fierce, disfigured man strode in. He named himself like a court decree, bound the demons with cords that smoked when tightened, sealed their foreheads with Yama's square, and swore to rid the empire of evil. When the emperor woke, he remembered it as sharply as a verdict. To preserve the vision, he summoned Wu Daozi, the greatest painter of the age, and ordered him to set the figure down in ink. And here's a truth in Chinese belief: a painting is not just pigment, it's a gate. If the brush carries spirit, the figure can step through. Wu Daozi's dragons were said to shake off walls, his saints to walk at night. When he painted Zhong Kui, he gave the Demon-Queller a door through which to cross whenever called. From that moment, his image spread. Families pasted Zhong Kui portraits on their doors, especially at New Year. His face alone was believed to terrify demons, drive out disease and bar misfortune. He became one of the great door gods, but unlike others, he needed no weapon in hand. His gaze was enough, and he was never shown without his mount, the tiger. In Chinese tradition, the tiger is king of beasts, ruler of mountains, eater of ghosts, guardian of children. That's why tigers are painted on babies' shoes and stitched onto their hats. So even infants are guarded from spirits. Zhong Kui riding a tiger is more than a symbol. It's the king of the living carrying the marshal of the dead, crushing all that threatens humankind. Opposite the tiger stands its eternal partner, the dragon. The tiger rules earth and mountain. The dragon rules heaven and river. They are yin and yang in motion, balance itself. To ride the tiger is to stand in that balance, astride the frontier of life and death, order and chaos, man and spirit. Armed with sword and seal, flanked by black and white impermanence, and by ox head and horse face, Zhong Kui goes out against every form of evil. Trickster fox spirits who ensnare with desire. Plague gods who wear sickness like a cloak. River spirits who demand sacrifice. Dream demons who slip into the mind at night. Even petty ghosts. Thieves, child snatchers, terrors that lurk at the edge of sleep. All fall within his jurisdiction. And this is where the number 36 matters. Zhong Kui's deeds are told through 36 great exorcisms. Not an accident of counting, but a number of completion. 6 times 6. The 6 directions of space multiplied against themselves, sealing every corner of the world. 49, 7 times 7, belongs to the Buddhists. The soul's 49-day journey after death. 81, 9 times 9, is the ultimate cycle. The trials of journey to the West, the days of Taoist alchemy needed to refine immortal elixirs. Numbers like these are seals, signs that a story has covered everything there is. So when Zhong Kui is said to have 36 exorcisms, it means he has faced every kind of haunting under heaven. So don't think of his tales as scattered stories. They are a full casebook, a cosmic ledger of justice against the spirit world. And that's what we're covering in this video. The complete cycle of Zhong Kui's demon-quelling deeds. From the emperor's fever dream, to fox spirits in the night, to plagues that rose like armies and threatened entire cities. Just a heads up, this video plays more like a storybook, long form with few illustrations. But if you stay, I think you'll find it worth the ride. And if you enjoy this kind of storytelling, there's plenty more to come. Journey to the West from beginning to end, the saga of the 3 kingdoms, even the myths of Zeus and Olympus. So hit that subscribe if you love great legends. And let's get started. Winter thinned and gave to an early Tang spring. The streets of Chang'an breathed steam from horse muzzles and cook stalls. Banners along the Taiji palace walls hung damp with dawn. In those days there lived a prodigy whose face startled gatekeepers and whose scholarship silenced censors. Zhong Kui wrote with a blade's steadiness. His brush made tight knots of meaning. His memory stacked the classics as if he were setting bricks, yet his brow was broken by fate's joke. A heavy, ruined cast that frightened children and drew whispers at the well. He traveled for the palace examinations with frost on his sleeves and a gourd against his hip. At the Vermilion Gate, clerks measured lineage and handwriting, not the structure of a man's heart. He wrote answers that folded law and mercy together, quoted histories without vanity, and ended with a proposal to bind the living and the dead to the same standard record. When results were read, courtyards rang with applause for lesser men. The final stroke fell not on paper, but on him. Rejection for his face alone. He climbed the palace steps with his papers tucked as if they were a funeral bundle. The stone balustrade kept no counsel. He had argued for a world aligned like a well-set ledger. Now the ledger tore. He struck his head upon the steps and went down into the dark that has its own roads and tolls. The descent took on the textures of the nether. Reeds rasped in invisible wind. Water sounded without a source. A ferry bell marked a crossing no boatman could be seen to serve. Ox head and horse face came as officials come. Ledgers under arm, shackles at their belts, Duty plain, no cruelty wasted. They knew his name because names have weight there, and his already pressed a crease into the records. King Yama sat where judgments are measured by consequence rather than favor. The lord of the courts of earth and shade had the face of an absolute magistrate, a straight mouth, a gaze that made scales unnecessary. He read the flicker of a life that should have been long and public. He saw talent insulted by a gate. He granted an office not available among the living. Thus Zhong Kui received the nether appointment. King Yama invested him with the office of ghost quelling and placed an iron seal in his hand. The remit was precise: jurisdiction over malefic spirits and renegade shades, right to bind with registers written in red, power to arrest in any precinct of the dark without fear of reprisal from local powers. Shackles from hell's forges were issued, and a tiger from the nether kennels bowed under him as a mount, striped like a written warning. The seal took on the warmth of his palm. He tested it against airs that stank of grave sweetness, and heard, as one hears a temple bell ring a second time inside the chest, the answer of authority agreeing with purpose. Above, in the world of banners and tax grain, an emperor turned in fever. The dream that followed would open the first case. Chapter 1. The Emperor's Fever and the Arrest. Within the dream night held the Taiji Palace in a chill grip. Frost made the bronze studs on the main gates look like seeds embedded in ice. A bell from the inner court told the hour. Its tone was thin, as if sound had to fight through damp silk. In the private chamber, braziers breathed dull orange. The emperor's pulse beat in his throat like a messenger knocking from within. The dream reformed as dreams do when they are not fancy, but visitation. A corridor unrolled between carved screens. Wind from nowhere stirred bead curtains. Lamplight lifted and settled as though deciding what to reveal. A small shape skittered, the color of old lacquer. It had the hands of a child and the mouth of a purse, and it made the emperor's medicine pouch lighter by the weight of a sigh. Behind it came a line of opportunists, thin shades with sleeves stitched from palace rumors, a long-nosed thing that had learned to smell jade through wood, a moth-pale face attracted to authority the way flame calls wings. Zhong Kui entered as if he had always had the right to this ground. Origin binds conduct. A man who has been invested does not need to announce it twice, yet he did as law requires. He named the precinct, named himself, named the sovereign on whose behalf he declared order. He drew the demon-quelling sword only enough to show its edge, then set it back as a judge closes a case file until needed. He laid out his instruments on an invisible table: brush, red ink register, iron seal, cords looped like quiet snakes, a gourd that clicked softly when set down. He wrote the first line of the charge: theft under the lamp of the Son of Heaven, aggravated by intrusion into the imperial sick room. He did not hurry his script. The first imp ran when the brush spoke its name. It slid under a screen. He did not follow with his body. He sent the cord. It went along the floor as if it understood corners, then leapt, and the small thing's ankles shouted surprise. He pulled it back, not to himself, but to the record. The name sank into ink. The cord tightened. The mouth that was a purse spat out a pinch of something bitter. It was the emperor's scattered remedy, crumbled by spirit fingers. He returned it to the pouch and stamped the pouch's shadow with the iron seal so it could not be stolen twice by the same trick. Oxhead and Horseface appeared at the corridor's far end, formal as they are in every precinct. They did not act without remit above ground. Zhong Kui gave them the paper that made a bridge between realms, a temporary warrant, red-signed, citing King Yama's authority and the sovereign's presence within the dream. They stood as witnesses rather than hunters. Witness is a kind of chain. The long-nosed thief made for the coffer where the jade seal slept. Zhong Kui stepped sideways to change the draft in the corridor, turning the lamp's flame so that shadow ran across the floor like a thrown net. He set his foot on the shadow, and the thief's limbs locked. He announced the second charge. Attempt upon the seal of state. Conspiracy under fever's cover. He bound it with a loop of cord that grew heavier when a name confessed itself. The moth-faced thing hovered along the bed curtain, sipping fear. Zhong Kui did not cut it. He covered it with the gourd and shook salt into the neck, then sealed the mouth with a thumb impressed in red. He spoke the condition that makes mercy dear. It would be unstoppered only to testify against worse, else consigned to 3 winters of blind wandering in the outer courts. The emperor, in the bed that was both bed and dais, turned his head. Sweat cooled, as if a window had opened in a wall no one could see. Fever's hand loosened. Xuanzong's mind, lucid even within the scene, recognized utility. Sovereigns do not embrace strangers, they employ them. He regarded the disfigured officer and measured. He promised in that narrow place, in words that later woke as policy, public acknowledgement, and mandate. Zhong Kui answered with an act instead of a bow. He pressed the iron seal to the threshold of the chamber. Its hiss made the lamps steady. He wrote a final line naming the chamber inviolate for a cycle of days. Then he made the arrests formal. Names read aloud, cords tightened, seals applied, witnesses noted, transport assigned. He marched the bound things toward the far stair that goes down even in dreams. By morning, the fever broke. The emperor ordered Wu Daozi to paint the ghost-queller as a ward and set protocol that the image, when hung, would serve as lawful conduit between court and city. From that day, his nether office answered summons among the living. Thus ended the first exorcism out of 36, arrests executed within Emperor Xuanzong's fever dream, imperial mandate established. Chapter 2. The little thief of the Inner Court Lantern Festival pressed against the city like a second daylight made of silk. In the palace precincts, however, shadows gathered where ceremony is thin. The day after the portrait was hung, a rumor ran along the eaves. A pouch had gone light again, not in dream, but in the waking corridors near the imperial wardrobe. The pouch held winter pills of musk and cinnamon, measured for the emperor's recovery. Loss measured in grains can become loss measured in weeks. Zhong Kui arrived not with noise, but with the authority that makes doors unlatch. The Taiji Palace's stone paths sweated from the day's thaw and the night's cold. His boot left prints that blurred at the edges like a thing seen between realms. He stopped short of the threshold, where palace rules change a man's posture. He asked for the steward of the wardrobe in the manner of an officer who knows that process is stronger than personal temper. The steward's face pinched. His bow was exact. His hands trembled on the ledger. Origin integration settled as he prepared the ground. City god, Cheng Huang, held jurisdiction over the living quarters' streets. But palace land was the emperor's immediate household, a mixed terrain of ritual and law. Zhong Kui noted the boundaries, wrote them in the margin of his red register, and stamped the corner so that no local deity could later claim insult by overreach. He worked without spectacle. He dusted the floor with a pinch of ash from his gourd and watched for footprints that ash could tell. He tied a shoulder cord around a screen pillar. If a thing passed that way without a name, the cord would heat his wrist. He set the iron seal upon the wardrobe coffer and whispered a line of law. Not spell, but injunction. He drew the demon-quelling sword only to tap its scabbard once upon the stone. Permission to enforce, recorded. The thief came as the festival drums began beyond the walls. It was small again. Not the very same, but of a breed. A palace learner. Grown clever from centuries of watching servants tuck things away. It pinched the pouch's mouth and tiptoed, which is a foolishness in spirits as in men. Tiptoeing puts all attention on feet and none on air. The air thickened around it. He did not chase. He named it, and naming tightened the world until it turned and showed its face. He announced the charge. Theft of imperial medicine within the warded precinct. Second offense by kind. Contempt of the newly posted mandate. He threw the cord. The pillar cord answered from behind with a sting in his wrist. A second accomplice slipped along the screen. He pivoted, using the wardrobe's open door as a shield to force a corridor between the two. Space is an instrument. He pressed the first imp back with the flat of the sword to keep it from spilling the pouch. With his free hand, he wrote 2 characters on the floor. Stop here. The ink rose like a low step. The accomplice tripped without seeing the reason and revealed itself with a hiss. Boxhead and Horseface entered with a palace guard as escort, both recognizing the unusual court. Zhong Kui handed the guard a copy of the charge written in standard script, not the nether shorthand, and had him read it aloud. Law speaks more clearly when spoken by the living. The imp stilled. The accomplice cursed in a nursery's voice. He marked both with the iron seal, lower left of the brow, the place where stubbornness pools. He assigned transport to the nether officials and required their testimony in the city god's temple at dusk, to establish precedent that palace theft by spirit is a matter of public order, not private affront. Hu Daozi's portrait, hung along the corridor outside, seemed to tilt. Servants whispered that its eyes followed the cords. Fear traveled down the hall, then spent itself at the threshold and did not cross. The emperor's steward wept once, a clean sound like water poured, then mastered himself and signed the ledger acknowledging recovery of the medicine and custody of the sealed pouch. When dusk came, the city god sat in borrowed ceremony at the palace's outer shrine. Black and white impermanence stood like painted doors. Zhong Kui presented the 2 imps for witness and sentence. He spoke without edge, for edge is for steel. In court, clarity is enough. He had one confined to inventory work in the outer courts, counting nameless grave markers for a year, binding its energy to patience. He had the other sent to the river precinct to carry warnings to water ghosts about jurisdiction. Mercy cost coin from his own gourd. 3 drops of lamp oil poured for the city god's shrine as fee for the borrowed dais. The moral lay in the public nature of the correction. Theft committed in the seam between dream and waking had been brought into daylight procedure. The palace learned to keep its fear behind the portrait, not in front of it. Thus ended exorcism 2 out of 36. Little imp caught stealing the imperial pouch in the waking palace. Chapter 3. Returning the seal. A north wind scraped the lacquer from the sky. Day after Lantern Festival, courtiers carried lanterns home in daylight, their frames exposed as thin bones. News came in a whisper that moved faster than horses. A clerk in the seal repository had found the great coffer's weight, changed by the fraction that makes stomachs fall. The imperial jade was present. The cords were untouched, but something in the box had been replaced by the idea of itself. The seal repository was a square building with the manners of a fortress. 1 door, 2 locks, 3 witnesses for each opening. Its floor was a lacquered grid, each square named. Zhong Kui stood at the threshold and asked for the witnesses. Their names sat on the tongue like dried persimmon, honest, tight with anxiety. He took their statements in order, wrote them in his red register, and stamped the bottom with the iron seal so that fear could not edit the lines later. He had the coffer brought to the center square. He did not open it. He addressed it. Origin integrated itself once more. An imperial seal is more than a stone. It is a pact between sky and earth given a handle. Things that hunt symbols hunt the handles. He tied cords not to the box, but to its shadow. He circled the coffer with the demon-quelling sword held low, not to threaten, but to strike sparks along the floor. The sparks fell like small stars and did not die. They clung to the lacquer and traced an outline that the eye could not keep but the mind could feel. He set the iron seal within that outline, and the room's air shifted as when a court rises to its feet. The substitution showed itself as a sheen like oil. It ran across the box's surface, found the cords on the shadow, jerked once, and tried to flee through the gap under the door. He laid the brush down to bar the gap. The bristles splayed like reeds across a narrow stream. The thing caught and thrashed. He announced the charge: attempt to abstract the essence of the imperial seal by spectral counterfeit, infiltration of witness procedure, seduction of a clerk's attention. The witnesses looked as if a sudden weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Seduction of attention is a theft few notice until it is gone. Black and white impermanence entered, both faces exact as mask paint, carrying chains that do not chime. They acknowledged the seal of King Yama and the emperor's edict posted after the dream. They took custody of the thing, which flattened itself like a gloss across their sleeves, and then settled as a square patch the size of a hand. He required them to display it later in the public court, so that artisans could learn to recognize such sheen and paint stronger borders on official chests. Only then did he open the coffer. The jade lay within, warmed to the temperature of guarded breath. He closed it and wrote a return in the ledger. Seal verified, repository affirmed, witnesses cleared with cautionary note regarding attention work by spirits. The city god's emissary arrived with a petition. Local powers disliked the notion that an inner palace matter be dragged to their altar. He answered in writing with courtesy and force, explaining the boundary. When a counterfeit threatens the integrity of mandates, it enters city order. He sent the emissary away with a paper stamped twice, Nether and Imperial, so that future disputes could be settled by reference rather than raised voice. The moral emerged not as speech, but as practice. A symbol kept only by locks invites seduction. A symbol made public in its procedures becomes heavier than cunning. Thus ended exorcism number 3 out of 36. Essence theft at the seal repository reversed. The imperial seal's integrity restored. Chapter 4. Plague breath over Chang'an. The thaw came in fits. Wind dragged damp over the walls of Chang'an, and the city swelled with travelers returning from Lantern Festival. Drums had gone quiet. Incense smoke in ward shrines thinned to pale threads. Then fevers rose like brush fire along the streets of butchers and grain factors. Infants burned and cooled in the space of a watch. Strong men woke with ash tongues and lay down before noon. Word reached the city god's yamen that door thresholds smelled of copper and that dogs howled at corners where no one stood. Zhong Kui entered by the East Market Gate with his tiger stepping light to keep from scaring horses. He did not ride into alleys, he walked, counting coughs by intersections, reading the pattern as one reads currents in a river. He stopped at the city god's temple, whose courtyard tiles were washed twice daily and yet felt unclean. The city god's clerk presented petitions in both neat hand and tremor. The ghost quencher listened, then set his iron seal upon the petition stack to make the city's pleading part of the record. Plague gods, the Wen Shen, are officials of calamity who travel in companies, each bearing a season's malice. They settle by lamps, drink breath, and mark lintels with fingers unseen. They can be bought off with riot or appeased with error. They respect jurisdiction when it is spoken with proper stamps. Zhong Kui laid out his instruments: red register, talisman brush, cords, the gourd that held salt and ash. He marked a boundary down Vermilion Bird Avenue, 3 intersecting sigils granting him passage in the living realm by imperial investiture, and binding rights in the dark by Yama's office. He proceeded as a magistrate proceeds: charges first, blade second. He named the district, north of the Butcher's Row, west of the bean-curd stalls, under emergency order. He declared the offense: unlawful spread of pestilence without petition to the city god, contempt of the capital's rights, theft of breath from infants. He stamped the iron seal on the street warden's ledger so that rationing and closures would have the weight of both realms. Then he worked doors. At each afflicted threshold, he posted a talisman that was not charm but warrant: brush strokes firm, lungs to be returned, fever to be unseated, passage denied to carriers named in the register. He set bowls of clean water under lamp hooks and floated willow leaves as indicators. Where a leaf halted with its stem pointing north, a Wen Shen watched. He did not hunt them with swagger. He assembled them with law. He called for Oxhead and Horseface to stand at alley mouths as witnesses. He spoke the names of the 4 known bearers of spring plague this cycle: Red Gums, Short Breath, Night Pulse, and Whisper Sweat, names drawn from the nether docket. When the air thickened and the willow leaves leaned, he drew the demon-quelling sword and traced a circle no cartwheel could match. The circle did not cut, it convened. Within it, shapes gathered, tall, hat-brimmed silhouettes with sleeves like funeral flags. He offered no incense to bribe them. He read the charges, he set terms. Withdraw beyond the 3rd milestone by sundown. Cease taking infant breath. Submit to counting by black and white impermanence for the tally of wrongs. Or be bound, sealed, and marched in fetters to the cold sheds of the 5th Court. They tested his cord with the sly pull of experienced officials. The cord did not move because it ran through the seal in his hand and the edict behind his back. At sundown, 2 fled and 2 complied. He marked the fleeing pair for pursuit by nether bailiffs and forbade their names from entering the city again this season. He bound the ones who stayed with thin shackles that sing only to guilty wrists and sent them, escorted by Oxhead and Horseface, to declare in the city God's outer hall the root of contagion. He then required from the city god a counter-signature authorizing street closures and night watch bell patterns, 3 short, 1 long, so citizens could read order in the dark. By morning, the fever line bent, smoke thinned. The markets opened with distance between stalls wide enough to let wind through. He returned to the East Market Gate and posted a notice below Wu Daozi's portrait. The image's ward now recognized in all 20 wards as a summons. Households that pasted the likeness at their door could beat once on a basin and expect his notice when the basin stilled. The moral lay in the texture of the city itself. Plague withdrew not by private mercy, but by public rule spoken with layered authority and witnessed in open courts. Thus ended exorcism number 4 out of 36. Plague bearers convened, bound by warrant, and driven from Chang'an wards. Chapter 5. Lantern ghosts under the upper prime night came with festival residue. Paper lotuses trapped in gutters, spent wax hard as shells, smoke nested in rafters. The 15th had passed, but the city's hands still reached for light. In the ward of silk dyers, a string of lanterns refused to gutter, though rain slicked the street stones. Children pointed and then fell drowsy where they stood. A young porter stumbled under a frame of carp lanterns and did not wake when shaken. Lantern ghosts, born from neglect, crowd heat, and the envy of dark corners, inhabit festival lights that outlast their night. They feed by coaxing eyes to climb their flame and step out of the body for a moment too long. Zhong Kui came while the ward watch untied a line of lamps and found they would not come down. He set the tiger at the alley's mouth to keep the curious from pressing in. He addressed the ward elder as one official to another, then hung a small copy of Wu Daozi's portrait from the lintel of the dye hall opposite. The portrait's eyes, dark as wet ink, looked across at the lanterns. He set a brass bowl below it and poured a ladle of clean water until it stilled to a mirror. He announced precinct, offense, and remedy. Unauthorized enthrallment of citizens after the festival's appointed hours. Refusal to quit property after lease of light expired. Seduction of minors. He wrote the names lantern ghosts sometimes answer to redfish, silk moth, paper wife, onto slips and pinned them to cords, dangling just above the flames. He did not cut the lamps. He starved them with attention properly directed. When the portrait's gaze and the bowl's water made a corridor, the trapped fascination loosened. He used the demon-quelling sword not to strike but to measure. 2 arm lengths to the left of the carp lantern frame, 1 step back from the eave drip. He brought the iron seal down on the air as on a delinquent account. The cords twitched. The first ghost sloughed off like a film of oil, slid toward the bowl, and sank. The others followed in fits, trying to climb back to cloth and wick, finding no purchase where his warrant lay. Black and white impermanents arrived at a trot, their chains quiet as dew on hair. He handed them the bowl to cap and carry. He read the penalty. 7 nights of service relighting grave candles that storms had snatched. Then testimony in the city god's court against the lantern seller who failed to extinguish his stock and thus invited infestation. Mercy appeared as labor, not as pardon. He wrote a caution to the ward records. On the night after upper prime, lanterns must be lowered with names spoken and wicks pinched under the watch's eye, so the city's affection for light would not be used against it. The porter woke with a cry, like someone who had come back from too far. The children stirred as if put down from a tall man's shoulders. The moral lay in the city's discipline of joy. Light that ignores the hour becomes a door for hunger. A festival's end must be kept as carefully as its beginning. Thus ended exorcism number 5 out of 36. Festival lamp ghosts drawn off, sealed, and sentenced to grave light duty. Chapter 6. The Fox Who Borrowed a Body. Spring's first true rain combed the dust from willow catkins and set thin rivulets running along the lanes of the scholars' ward. In a house with bamboo latticework and a plum tree that bloomed late, a family kept vigil over a young woman whose breath had stopped 2 nights prior. By dusk of the 3rd day she sat up, asked for a mirror, and called an unfamiliar name with a tone that made the elders' necks grow cold. Fox spirits, the Huli Jing, are old as threshing floors and clever as tax clerks. They borrow bodies as thieves borrow ladders, to reach what they cannot otherwise touch. Sometimes they wear the dead to collect a dowry. Sometimes they take a living form thin enough to be mistaken for nostalgia. Word reached Zhong Kui before the 4th incense stick burned down in the vigil hall. He came without fanfare, leaving the tiger tied to the outer post to ease the neighbors. He asked the family to keep the door open and the lamp steady. He surveyed the room. the late plum's scent, the damp hem of the mat, the mirror's bronze back stamped with river beasts, the girl's hands too restless for a third day of stillness. He placed Wu Daozi's small portrait facing the mirror and angled the brass so that the painted gaze would catch any lie that traveled by reflection. He announced the court and the charge: unlawful occupation of a mortal vessel without petition to the nether authorities, attempted fraud upon dowry and lineage, endangerment of household spirits assigned to guard the ancestral tablets. He unrolled the red register and left a space where the occupying name would write itself if pressed. He then took a pinch of millet from his gourd and cast it in a circle. The old test that foxes dislike stepping over because each grain looks like an eye. The body's lips formed a smile, not the family's, and the foot hesitated at the millet. He did not draw steel yet. He wrote a small talisman and slid it beneath the threshold to fix the room. He spoke the name of fox in its 3 common variants, from hill, from market, from riverbank, to touch the true one without exhibition. The wrists twitched. The neck turned too smoothly. He used the demon-quelling sword to raise the girl's shadow from the floor by a finger's breadth and set the iron seal upon that shadow to keep it from tearing. Then he addressed the intruder as a clerk addresses a petitioner with no papers. He offered the lawful path. Step out, be bound, and speak in court to the grievance that made this theft, or be cut from the host and lashed to the lintel until the 3rd watch, then hauled before King Yama's bailiffs for resisting arrest above ground. It tried soft words through the dead girl's teeth, promising to leave after a marriage supper the family had hoped for. He ignored the promise. He brushed the millet aside to open a corridor and cast a cord across the empty span. The cord smoked where it touched fur that was not there to eyes, but present to law. The fox broke cover, a pale outline sliding backward, still linked to the body by a smear of light. He drew the sword cleanly and struck, not flesh, but the smear that bound. The link snapped with a sound like a bowstring loosed. The body fell back, heavy as it should be, and the fox bolted for the mirror. The portrait's gaze met it. The bronze darkened. He stamped the mirror's back with the iron seal, and the fox's shape flattened into the metal, its tail tip twitching a last defiance before the seal cooled. Oxhead and Horseface came at his summons and took the mirror wrapped in mourning cloth. He required from them a public statement in the city god's hall, naming the village where the fox's den lay, so that wardens could watch for further borrowings. He returned the girl's shadow to her quietly, pressing it with the iron seal where spine meets mat, and instructed the family to keep water by the bed and not speak to her until morning, so the soul would seat itself without entanglement. Mercy cost him lamp oil and a gourd's worth of strength. He left both at the household shrine and walked out with his shoulders set. The moral showed itself in the way grief opens doors. Love will invite any semblance to return. Law must guard the threshold until the true steps through. Thus ended exorcism number 6 out of 36. Fox spirit expelled from a borrowed body. Mirror sealed for transport. Chapter 7. The river's demand. Snowmelt swelled the Wei River until it shouldered barges from their moorings and gnawed at the ferry steps. A rumor arrived by cold courier. Along the bend below the grain tax depot, offerings had appeared without priest or order: cakes of rice, a child's shoe, a hen with its feet tied. At midnight, a voice like a wind in a jar had whispered from the reeds that the flood would take what the city would not give. River gods hold old patents. They remember sacrifices the law has since forbidden. In a year of hard water, they test the banks and the people's resolve. Zhong Kui rode the tiger along the levee at dusk, passing men with shoulder poles and women with lampshades over their baskets to keep the rain off. He left the mount at the ferry stairs and went down with cords across his chest, like a bailiff ready for a rough arrest. He set a tripod on the wet stones and placed upon it an edict burned into a thin board. The emperor's command that human blood not be spilled to bargain with waters. He weighed the board with the iron seal. He called the city god's river clerk to stand witness, and he named the offense: extortion by threat of flood, solicitation of unlawful sacrifice, disturbance of transport under imperial grain. The river answered with a heave and a shadow, long and jointed like a rope dragged sideways. A head rose, antlered and blind-looking, as if sight were a courtesy it did not often grant. It claimed old rights in the way a landlord claims a courtyard that has since become a road. He replied by reading the layers of his office as one reads a warrant. Nether authority over malefic entities meddling with the living, imperial passage to act where transport and levy are threatened. The portrait ward's standing conduit, which made every ferry stair a door he could lawfully step through, because households up and down the bank had pasted his likeness and burned paper at New Year. He threw a cord the river thought it could break. Cords woven in Diu have a memory for wrists and throats, and this one tightened when the water rose. The head lunged. He stepped off the stair to change the angle, letting the pull run past him into the levee stones. He drew the demon-quelling sword and cut the run of current at the knee, not the neck. Water tripped. The shadow rolled. Reeds flattened. The tied hen skittered free. Boxhead and Horseface could not wade far without dissolving their testimony, so they stood high and called counts as the arrest proceeded. Solicitation, threat, unlawful taking of river tithe beyond established measure. He bound the thing at the base of one antler with shackles that rang dull as if striking wet wood. He pronounced sentence not as insult, but as repair. The river god would carry 3 barges of tax grain past the bend without toll, then sit binding shackled at the ferry stair during market for 7 days to watch children hop the stones dry-shod. If it raged, he would haul it below to the courts that dry even fish eyes. The old shadow tried once more to shake him into the water. He stamped the iron seal upon the stair, and the stair became a character in stone that the river had to respect. The water lowered by a man's hand. Not surrender, but compliance. He had the tide offerings gathered and redistributed, rice cakes to the poor along the bank, the hen to the ferry keeper's coop with instruction to hatch it under watch, the child's shoe placed on the temple step, to be claimed by the mother who had been frightened into error. He wrote a notice for the levee's post. Lawful offerings are paper boats and petitions. Unlawful are blood and fear. Wardens read it aloud at dusk. The moral lay in the correction of memory. A city does not feed its river with terror. It binds its bargains in open ink. Thus ended exorcism number 7 out of 36. River god's demand quashed. Service exacted. Unlawful offerings dispersed. Chapter 8. The Copper Mirror Exchange. The market after rain showed faces in puddles and prices in raised fingers. In the lane of metal sellers, a woman bargained for a bronze mirror with a back chased in vines. She turned it, and for a blink her eyes were not her own. A boy behind her shrieked that his mother had become someone who did not know him. The vendor swore his stock was clean. A runner from the ward yamen reached Zhong Kui before the stall could be surrounded by the kind of crowd that breeds theft. He came with the portrait ward fluttering in small copies from eaves. Households had taken to pasting them after the plague case, and the image's conduit tugged lightly at him as he crossed thresholds. Mirrors are doors if made so. They carry likeness the way a river carries boats. A cunning shade had been exchanging true mirrors for instruments that loaned faces to other things, letting foxes and petty demons walk the market without showing their edges. He borrowed a trestle from the vendor and set 3 mirrors in a row. The suspect, a known clean one from his own kit, and a water bowl smoothed by a handful of fine ash. He announced precinct, charge, and remedy. Substitution of regulated household goods with spirit work. Abetment of disguise in a market. Endangerment of a child's recognition of kin. He had the vendor repeat the words so the stall would remember them. He breathed upon each surface in turn. True bronze bloomed and faded from his breath with the patience of metal. The suspect showed no bloom. It drank the breath and gave back a second face behind his. One that tried to put on his features like a mask dropped at a festival. He set the iron seal on the mirror's rim to keep its edges from wandering. He traced with the demon-quelling sword a narrow arch in the air, as though lifting a doorway just enough to force a guest to stoop. Black and white impermanence entered from either side like lintels meeting. He wrote a line in the red register, leaving space for the maker's signature to appear. A bead of dark, as if a drop of tarnish had gathered thought, formed at the mirror's lower edge and rolled upward, resolving into a name written in a script used by itinerant charm sellers who work behind bathhouses. He had the market bailiff send for that man from his usual corner. When the charm seller arrived, Zhong Kui did not address him as a priest, but as a trader in contraband rights. He read the charges and placed the clean mirror beside the foul so the man could see the difference his work had made in a boy's cry. He bound the mirror with cords and assigned it to transport. He bound the charm seller's wrists with the lightest shackles, for he had not killed, but had aided a theft of trust. Sentence was practical. The mirror would be carried to the city god's hall and held as evidence. Afterward, it would be hammered flat under witness and recast into bowls for funerary water, its mischief turned toward cleansing. The charm seller was set to a month of scraping names from stolen mirrors under black and white's gaze, then given the choice of apprenticing to a legitimate bronze worker or being marked on the brow with a character meaning unreliable, the social death he had tried to inflict upon others. He turned to the woman and the boy and restored recognition by setting the iron seal between their reflections in the basin. When the water stilled, the boy's eyes found his mother's as if crossing a bridge. He purchased the suspect mirror from the stall with the gourd's coin, an officer's expense, and wrote the payment into the record so the vendor would not be ruined by an evil he had not invited but had failed to detect. The moral lay in commerce made clean. Markets are temples of exchange. When a mirror sells falsity, it sells a crack in the city's face. Repair requires both hammer and law. Thus ended exorcism number 8 out of 36. Counterfeit bronze mirror seized. Maker bound. Recognition restored. Chapter 9. Night procession of 100 demons. A moonless third watch pressed cloth dark over Chang'an. Curfew drums counted the emptiness between torch posts. Shuttered tea stalls exhaled their last steam into the lanes. Then came the shuffle of many feet with no sandals, and the papery clack of banners carried by hands that never fully warmed. From the south gate's shadow spilled a column. Gourd-headed lamp-bearers, reed-thin pipers, pallid standard-bearers with pennons painted in ash, and at their head a marshal whose drum-skin face bore tally marks for nights survived. The city god's patrol fled the corner, rather than be trampled into nightmares. A ward runner reached Zhong Kui at the Yamen portico, where Wu Daozi's portrait hung like a still wind. He set out on foot, Tiger pacing the rooftops above to keep the column honest, and declared, for the record and the dark, that he was assuming emergency jurisdiction under Nether Office and Imperial Passage. the portrait ward extending his conduit along streets where households had pasted his likeness after New Year. He met the vanguard at Cross Halberd Street. He announced precinct and offense, armed and unlawful transit through the sleeping city, intimidation of wardens, solicitation of dread. He laid his red ink register on a tea-stall counter and inked 3 lines naming the route he would permit if they proved they came on errand, not conquest. The 100-demon marshal beat his ribs like a drum and tried to pass by claiming custom. Zhong Kui set cords knee-high across the lane and pressed the iron seal into the cobbles so the cords learned stubbornness from stone. The first ranks stumbled. The pennons dipped. He drew the demon-quelling sword just far enough to show edge and traced a gate in the air. Narrow, rectangular, bureaucratic. If they wished to cross his city, they would pass through law. Inside the tea stall, he filled a basin and steadied the water. The painted gaze across the way looked into the bowl, and anything that sought to hide its face found itself described in the surface. Names rose like steam. He called Oxhead and Horseface to stand as witnesses at either cheek of the gate, chains looped but quiet. He set terms as a magistrate sets toll, musicians disarmed of bone flutes, banner ghosts to furl flags, the marshal to surrender his grief drum and march at the column's rear. No pausing, no harvest of sleeper's breath, and the whole to quit the north gate by the 5th watch. To test their claim, he commanded them to carry, between them, 2 sealed gourds filled earlier with captured lantern ghosts, delivering them beyond the city ditch to the outer courts. He stamped the register to make the errand binding. They tried force once. The marshal raised his drum. The cords rose to meet it and tangled his stick hand. Zhong Kui named the count, resistance after lawful order, and brought the blade down upon the drum not to split skin but to cut sound. Silence broke their cadence. The column sloped, then straightened to pass, shuffling through the narrow gate of his drawing. He walked beside them as a clerk walks a debt to the counting house. At the north gate he took back the sealed gourds and had black and white impermanence call roll against the names written on the bowl's surface. The marshal came last, unarmed and diminished. Zhong Kui bound him with shackles that weigh judgment rather than iron, and assigned him to sweep the outer roads at dawn for 7 mornings, so the living would not stumble on discarded dread. The moral lay in the lesson given to fear. Spectacle cut to size by procedure will walk where it is told. Thus ended exorcism number 9 out of 36. Night procession halted, disarmed, and escorted beyond the walls under warrant. Chapter 10. The Child and the Dream Thing. Rain stitched a veil between eaves and street. In the ward of potters, a boy of 5 slept as if sunk in clay. His lips moved with a lover's borrowed sigh. His little hand pressed air as if catching a moth no one else could see. The mother had pasted Zhong Kui's likeness on the lintel at New Year. Now she struck a basin once and waited for stillness as the posted notice instructed. He entered the house without knocking because the portrait's conduit made the threshold an open summons. He announced precinct, offense, and his remit. An incubus of trivial grade, Mong Yu, had trespassed upon a minor. It would be arraigned. He set the iron seal on the boy's brow for the span of a breath and felt the thin tug, like a thread drawn toward a window in storm. He placed Wu Daozi's small portrait facing a bowl. He filled the bowl and waited until the water stilled to paper, then wrote the boy's name on its surface with the brush lifted dry. The ink did not run. It darkened the idea of water. He laid a cord around the pallet, loose as a garland, and hung from it 3 willow leaves to show direction of pull. He entered the dream as a magistrate steps through a court's side door, without theater. The room in the boy's mind glittered with river light that did not wet. A shadow in the shape of a bride offered sweets and sleep. He did not speak. He drew the demon-quelling sword a hand width and let its edge throw a bar of cold through summer imagery. He read the charge aloud, not to the bride shape but to the room, seduction of a minor through counterfeit comfort, theft of breath, conspiracy with the wet season's fevers. The thing's veil slipped. Its mouth was a wasp nest. Its hands were heavy where children are light. He set the iron seal upon the floorboards between them. The boards became characters for stop and yield. It tried pleading through the boy, which is a tactic used when a judge can be made to pity the wrong party. He bound his pity in the red register and ignored the words. He cast the cord into the dream's current and drew it tight from the waking room where the willow leaves lifted. The incubus surged. The leaves swung north. He shortened the line, kept the angle and cut, not flesh, but the tether where the thing drank. The dream's light went cold. He clapped the gourd over the wasp mouth and salted it shut. He sealed the mouth with a square of paper impressed from the iron seal, so the paper learned to be metal long enough to hold. Black and white impermanence took the gourd at the threshold between sleep and waking, careful not to touch the boy. He required them to present the thing in the city god's hall for naming, then ferry it to the cold sheds where desire is stored until it can no longer mimic a parent's hand. He instructed the mother without comforting her. Wash the pillow in water stirred with 3 strokes east to west. Hang mugwort for 7 nights. Do not speak to the boy as he wakes, only offer warm rice and wait. Mercy cost oil and a breath of his strength, paid into the household shrine. The moral lay in the channeling of care. Love becomes rescue when it calls law, and keeps silence where flattery would feed the thing. Thus ended exorcism number 10 out of 36. Incubus cut from a child's dream. Gourd sealed and conveyed to the outer courts. Chapter 11. Binding Oxhead and Horseface as witnesses. Mist lifted from the moat like breath leaving a bowl. In the city god's grand hall, incense made straight lines that leaned toward the dais where disputes between living policy and nether custom were argued. Merchants had petitioned to formalize new closures after the plague case. Rivermen objected, fearing lost hours under watchbell patterns. The earlier arrests would decide the rule if their facts could be read in open court without rumor's varnish. Zhong Kui entered in full office. Register at left, seal at right, cords coiled, sword at the back where it could be reached in a single turn. He announced his purpose and cited both layers of remit. Nether right to command witness from the courts below. Imperial passage to impose testimony on civic schedules. He called Oxhead and Horseface. Nether bailiffs do not habitually speak in the halls of the Yang. They looked to the city god, who shrank from the affront of precedent. Zhong Kui set his iron seal on the dais's edge close to where the steward's brush lay, and wrote a narrow injunction. By mandate of King Yama and acknowledgement of the emperor's dream, witnesses from the darker precincts would testify to facts that touch the living's order. He tightened a light cord around each bailiff's wrist, not to bind their bodies, but to bind their duty to the spoken word. He read counts from the plague docket, from the night procession, from the mirror market. Black and white impermanence stood like bookends. Oxhead described, in a flat voice fit for logs, the routes the Wenshen had taken, the hours when breaths were stolen fastest, the alleys that funneled dread like wind. Horseface recited the timing of the 100 demon column, the attempt at the grief drum, the conditions of passage imposed and met. Rivermen shifted their feet under the weight of listening. Merchants' hands grew still. The city god's steward tried to interject with local custom. Zhong Kui stamped the register's margin with the iron seal and cited consolidation from the palace. The portrait ward's recognition meant that summons issued under its eyes bore both realms' ink. He held up a small copy of the painting. Its gaze made a hush. He set the ruling in script. Watch bell patterns, 3 short, 1 long in times of fever. Lantern lowering at first watch after upper prime. Mirror inspection upon stall opening, and in these matters, nether officials could be called to speak again upon warrant. Oxhead and Horseface bowed with the impatience of officers who prefer arrest to talk. The chords cooled and fell away. The moral lay in the change to law itself. Testimony that crosses realms makes rules that weather rumor. Thus ended exorcism number 11 out of 36. Oxhead and Horseface bound to give public testimony, establishing civic protocols. Chapter 12, A Marriage for Zhong Qing. Late spring spilled green down the city ramparts and softened the voices in courtyards. Zhong Qing, whose gentleness was a rule that no demon could be allowed to test, poured tea in a quiet room where a plum branch threw lace on a mat. Du Ping, the upright scholar whose brush knew restraint, came with his elder and a clean ledger listing his obligations and line. They had met once under the lanterns when fear walked the streets. Respect had gathered since as steady as rain. Zhong Kui stood not as terror of spirits, but as brother and magistrate joined. He announced the precinct of the heart, in the same tone he used for wards. The marriage would be contracted under both sky and shade, witnessed by household ancestors and by the city god, protected by the nether seal against interference. He laid his iron seal upon the threshold to make his sister's safety a matter of law. He required from Du Ping the terms that respect sets, autonomy in her household rights, protection of her mother's tablets on days of offering, and a pledge that in seasons of plague his door would open to elders and orphans according to his means. Du Ping wrote the promises by his own hand, line straight, and accepted the weight of the register's red stamp at the bottom. For men and oaths are heavier when written into record before those who can enforce. At the city god's shrine, he placed a petition that explained the union and requested acknowledgement that no ancestral grievance would be stirred. The steward, seeing the iron seal lying like a black star upon the paper, signed in the city god's name with the deference of offices that understand each other. Zhong Kui then faced the darker side. He sent notice to King Yama's court, declaring a 3-day quiet around the bridal route, a corridor in which no petty spirit might make mischief on pain of irons. He set a ward of visible acts, doorway pasted with small copies of Wu Daozi's portrait, a basin of still water beneath, cords above the lintel looped once, then twice, willow boughs at either end. He posted a single talisman on the bridal palanquin, not to charm joy, which needs no ink, but to declare custody of the root. The wedding procession moved like a well-ordered column, drums measured and not boastful, bearers sure-footed, family feet sure on the flagstones. He walked at a distance that did not overshadow joy, but narrowed the road for anything seeking to step close. Brides are often prayed for by strangers. Today, strangers found themselves watched into blessing, not meddling. At the gate of Du Ping's house, he returned his iron seal to his belt and gave only this order to the threshold. Remember her as yours to keep from harm. If any shade had watched for a gap, it did not find one. The door closed on a new household and remained simply a door. The moral lay in law made tender. Justice, when it guards kin without favor and outsiders without injury, becomes a shelter rather than a blade. Thus ended exorcism number 12 out of 36. Sister Zhong Qing's marriage contracted, sealed, and warded under joint authority. Chapter 13. The False Bridegroom. The night after the wedding tasted of incense and steamed millet. Paper lotuses floated in a basin in the rear court. Their wicks, properly pinched, left no door open for hungry things. Yet a knock like polite knuckles sounded at the outer gate at the hour when well-wishers are done. A voice named itself Du Ping in a tone slightly too smooth. Within, Du Ping sat with family. The gatekeeper frowned and sent a boy for Zhong Kui before lifting the bar. He arrived as a neighbor arrives, unhurried, hat pulled low. But his registers and chords tapped against his ribs with purpose. He announced the precinct and offense in a low voice made for beams and brick. Attempted impersonation of a living man under cover of wedding rites. Intent to enter a protected threshold. Probable fraud upon lineage. He asked the gatekeeper to bring the household mirror that had seen the morning's bridal combing. Mirrors, remember. He set the mirror on the sill and turned Wu Daozi's small portrait to face it. He held the iron seal near enough to make the bronze think about truth. He asked the voice outside to bow toward the mirror, as courtesy requires. It bowed. Its face slid on like water over a mask and stuck a heartbeat late. He drew the demon-quelling sword to the length of a forearm and scratched on the air the two characters for halt. He unbarred the gate not to welcome, but to spring a trap whose sides were already written. The figure that entered wore Du Ping's festival robe and the smile of a man who wanted to be thought kind. Its shadow, however, stood a half-step away, as if remembering the wrong legs. Zhong Kui read the charge aloud and advanced on process rather than rage. He looped a cord low around the impostor's ankles where foxes and corpse spirits dislike attention. He pressed the iron seal to the impostor's brow. The skin hissed like a damp wick. The smile collapsed. The eyes slid sideways and showed the dark pupils of a river thing that had learned its shapes from watching boats put in and out. It tried pleading in Du Ping's tone, offering obedience, offering departure after one glance at the bride. He refused with the refusal that costs. No bargaining when innocents are at stake. He stepped to set angle and cut, not dramatic, but exact, taking the line that bound the impostor's chest to the threshold's breadth. The body convulsed and shrank into itself, shedding silk like a caught snake. What lay there a moment later was a long, wet shadow with the suggestion of gills. Oxhead and Horseface appeared at his call, their chains ready. He bound the thing with shackles hammered in the Fifth Court for offenders who trespass the living's rights. He assigned sentence in clear clauses. 7 cycles dragging sand upstream in the river precinct to unlearn the habit of taking what comes easy. Then testimony in the city god's hall naming the den that taught it wedding ways. If it balked, he would have its name hammered into the ferry stone for boatmen to spit on. He had the gate washed, threshold and hinges, with water stirred 3 times counterclockwise, and stamped the sill with the iron seal to close the book on the attempt. Inside, Du Ping and Zhongqing lit a small lamp, lowered it, and pinched it closed properly so that joy would neither brag nor dim. The moral lay in the defense of vows. A city that protects weddings from deceit teaches demons that love is not a door. Thus ended exorcism number 13 out of 36. River Thing posing as bridegroom exposed and cut from the threshold. Chapter 14. Purging the City. God's Hall. Early summer pressed heat into the flagstones. Incense bled sweet and stale along the ward where lawsuits and funerary carts crossed paths. At the city god's main temple, worshippers complained that prayers went thin and never came back heavy. Petitions pinned to the side altar curled black at the edges. A clerk began to stammer when reading verdict lots, as if an unseen finger turned his tongue. Zhong Kui approached through a court of stone lions dulled by dust. He announced precinct and charge with the calm of a ledger opened. Unlawful occupation of sacred office by an unregistered shade. Diversion of petitions. Extortion of offerings. Contempt of civic order. He laid his red register upon the steps, pressed the iron seal into the topmost edge, and made the stair a docket. City gods are magistrates of streets and homes. Their shrines are courts where smoke becomes record. He bowed once, not as suppliant, but as officer to officer, and requested the dais for inspection. The steward shifted, wary of precedent. Zhong Kui set a small copy of Wu Daozi's portrait at the right pillar. The painted gaze made the incense lean. He traced, with the demon-quelling sword's sheathed tip, a square about the main altar, then a second within it, narrower jurisdiction, then emergency authority. He examined the offerings trays, rice dulled as if handled too long, coins warm as if a palm refused to let go. He upended his gourd and shook out 3 pinches of ash in a triangulation around the altar. Where the ash settled, it sighed upward, caught by a draft with no wind. Petition eaters sometimes nest beneath the dais. They turn smoke sidewise and drink names before the deity can weigh them. He called black and white impermanents to stand as witnesses behind the screen. He read the charge aloud. He placed the iron seal beneath the altar board and heard the soft scrape of teeth against wood. He slid the demon-quelling sword under and lifted, not to pry, but to force light into the crawl. A long, bright smear, grease-given appetite, recoiled, its mouth shaped like the slot of a coffer. He looped a cord around the smear's middle. It thickened with protest. Cords woven in DU thickened back. He named counts as he tightened. Theft of prayers, imposture of office, emboldening of petty graft by making the hall feel profitless. He stamped the cord knot with the iron seal. The smear shuddered and clung to the stamp like a bad account to a signature. The city god, affronted but relieved, allowed the arrest to proceed upon his dais. Zhong Kui set sentence. 7 cycles cleansing soot from village shrines outside the walls, where wind and rain bite. Then return as evidence for artisans to learn how to nail altar planks without leaving layers. He ordered the steward to burn a corrective notice. Petitions would be read aloud at dusk for 7 nights. Names thickened by voice. Lots would be cast with 2 witnesses. The hall fund would be audited against incense sold. He poured oil from his gourd into the hall lamps, a cost taken on by his office, and walked the perimeter laying narrow talismans that were warrants, not charms. The smoke rose heavier. Worshippers' shoulders loosened as if a weight had slid off. The moral lay in the cleansing of institutions. When courts are emptied of parasites, the people's breath returns to them with the gravity it deserves. Thus ended exorcism number 14 out of 36. Petition eater rooted from the city. God's altar. Hall procedure restored. Chapter 15. Detox in a year of hard water. The rain failed, then failed again. Wells lowered until buckets kissed mud. Cloth cracked along wash lines. The air took on the taste of copper from heated stone. In such years, fevers come bitter and slow, and markets cough in rhythm. Physicians boiled herbs to paste. Grandmothers pinned red thread to sleeves. Still, the sickroom basins showed tongues the color of brick. Zhong Kui began at the granary. Drought plagues, on dich num han, travel in the breath of stored grain when watch is lax. He read the levy ledgers under the granary eaves. He stamped the steward's list so rationing would be law. not plea. He declared an emergency district along the south wards, where kiln heat and hunger meet, and cited his stacked remit. Nether authority to bind disease-bearers, imperial passage to command street order. The portrait ward's conduit to step any threshold that had pasted his likeness and petitioned by basin. He set up a line of brass basins filled from the cleanest well left and floated willow leaves as indicators. He brushed a single character, return, on each leaf's spine. Where a wenshen attended, the leaf ran upstream in still water. He mapped their stations, not to chase one by one, but to convene. He hung cords across 2 market lanes, knee-high, wrist-high, throat-high, and pressed the iron seal into the middle cobble to teach the cords patience. At the hottest hour, he struck the demon-quelling sword's scabbard twice on stone. The sound moved like a bell across dry air. Figures in broad, drooping hats drew near, sleeves hanging with the weight of stolen breath. He read the charges: spread of pestilence under drought, theft of strength from those who could least spare it, conspiracy with negligence in stores. He offered no incense. He offered terms. Withdraw beyond the mile markers. Carry water under black and white's count for 7 nights from river to ward cisterns, and disgorge stolen breath into the basins where it would be salted and buried, or be sealed and stacked in the 5th court's cold sheds until harvest. 2 tested the throat cord and found it unyielding, for it ran through his seal and the emperor's edict regarding public health. He cut their hats' rims with the sword's edge, not flesh, but presumption, and bound wrists with irons hammered thin for speed. The others wavered under the sight of witnesses. Oxhead, Horseface, and the city god's steward with a bell he rang not for worship but for civil order. Under escort they carried water until the 5th watch, stumbling, sleeves darkening with honest wet. He salted the basin surfaces and sealed them with paper taut by the iron stamp to hold back vapors until burial. He wrote new market hours into the ward record, shorter, cooler. He posted a law that red thread would be moved from sleeves to door latches, where it would bind families together and not tangle children's wrists. By the 7th morning, the fever's color paled. He purchased with his own gourd coin barley gruel for the line of kiln workers, writing the cost against himself in the margin of the register where officers confess their offerings. He set a path for physicians to speak nightly at the city god's steps, so instruction would weigh more than rumor. The moral lay in turning punishment into labor that cools the city. Thirst answered not by blood, but by buckets borne under warrant. Thus ended exorcism number 15 out of 36. Drought plague bearers bound to water carriage, fever line broken. Chapter 16. The Households. Hang the guardian wind from the western hills brought dust and a faint smell of resin. Before New Year, paper shops stacked fresh prints. After New Year, doors wore faces. In alley after alley, households pasted Wu Daozi's stern likeness, eyes inked to watch, sword angled within frame, robe hem lifting as if stepping from the paper. A basin set beneath each portrait trembled once and then stilled, the small sign that the conduit had taken. Zhong Kui walked a circuit at dusk, with cords looped and the iron seal knocking softly at his belt. He posted a formal notice at the East Market. The portrait ward stood recognized in all wards. Households that enshrined it gained standing summons to his office. Strength would scale with incense and collective use in seasons of danger. He wrote this consolidation in 3 lines and stamped twice. Imperial investiture above, nether remit below. So the city could read the stack. He tested the net. A cry broke from a dyer's lane where a child reached for a fallen lamp wick. The mother struck her basin once. the water steadied like a pupil. He stepped across 3 thresholds in a single breath, not by sorcery, but by law. Doors that displayed the portrait and had offered incense were corridors he could lawfully traverse. He arrived before the wick found cloth. A petty ember imp skittered, born from festival residue, kin to lamp ghosts but meaner. He announced charge and precinct in the single room's weight. He looped the cord and set the iron seal on the stove stone. The imp froze as if pinned by a chop. He salted a thimble, shook it into the gourd, and sent the thing with black and white for grave lamp duty. From there, a call beat from a copper worker's courtyard. The basin had juddered twice. The portrait's eyes seemed darker. A mirror sheen tried to form over a wife's face. The husband's hands shook over the cradle. He laid the sword sheath between mirror and bed, pressed the iron seal into the frame, and the sheen slid off like a bad layer of tin. He sighted the market case and posted at the gate a stamped line. Mirrors to be inspected weekly. Portrait-eyed doors serve as witness. Before the 5th watch, he had answered calls as if pulling on a net thrown wide. A fox at a sill, a cough thickening like paste, a shadow folding itself under a table. None became case length because the web caught them shallow. He ended the circuit at the ward shrine and counted basins, many still. He burned his own oil at the crossroads, a payment for using the people's conduit, and wrote that cost into his margin. The moral lay in the city's new habit. Guardianship distributed, power braided from paper, ink, incense, and law. Thus ended exorcism number 16 out of 36. Household portrait wards activated citywide. Rapid summons and shallow arrests established. Chapter 17. The tiger kneels under the seal. Autumn sharpened the edges of things. In a hamlet tucked under the southern ridge, a striped shadow took goats at noon and stared back at men who shouted from walls. Children stopped playing at the footpath. Women beat laundry with eyes on the scrub. A runner found Zhong Kui at the ferry, and he went uphill with his tiger padding silent at heel, the 2 stripes echoing and not the same. A mortal tiger is an office of the hills, fierce and blameless until hunger turns it upon pens. A demon-ridden beast wears its own strength crooked. He marked the hamlet boundary with a talisman pinned to a cartwheel. He announced the precinct in charge. Unlawful blood-taking within protected fields. Trespass under harvest. Suspected possession by a ridge thing that hates iron. He sent the people indoors and set his cords in a triangle about the goat pen, knots facing outward. He pressed the iron seal into the ground at the triangle's center. The earth took the impression with a hiss, then stilled, as if letters had cooled within it. He stood aside and laid the demon-quelling sword across his forearms, edge unseen, a magistrate's balance. The tiger came as dusk bled into hedge. It moved with a grace that asked to be admired and did not grant safety. It sprang. The cords rose not to choke, but to force its forepaws to land within the triangle. He spoke a single sentence. Not spell, but order. Naming its kind and office and commanding halt under joint authority. Nether seal and imperial peace of harvest. It crouched and growled. The ground remembered the seal's shape. Knees bent, the head lowered, the mouth closed on rage as on a bit. Beneath the fur something shivered that was not flesh. He stepped in and set the iron seal between the beast's eyes. Heat slicked his palm. A thread of shadow lifted from the tiger's spine, wriggled like a root worm, and tried for the hedge. He drew steel and cut the thread above the shoulder blades, the place where riders learn to sit and possessors try to ride. The thread whipped once and fell, twitching, into the dirt, where black and white pinned it with nails carried for such writhings. He bound the dirt knot with a loop and assigned it to the fifth court's keepers for burning along with rancid grave grease. The tiger panted, blinked, and moved its whiskers as if tasting rain. He lowered the seal and stepped back. The beast did not flee. It folded its forelegs and bowed until the seal's ghost cooled from its brow. He pointed with the sheathed sword toward the ridge and thence to the deer trails. It rose, shook flies from its shoulders, and went without looking back. A magistrate released with dignity. He had the hamlet mend its pens with iron nails hammered through characters he wrote on the lintels, and he required the headman to post watch until the first frost, not to kill, but to read sign. Mercy cost him gourd oil poured at the field shrine where scarecrows stand guard. The moral lay in ferocity made lawful. Strength kneels to rightful order when authority speaks with clean edge and clean seal. Thus ended exorcism number 17 out of 36. Possessor cut from a ravaging tiger. Beast compelled to yield and quit the pens. Chapter 18. The scholar's debt to a shadow bride. Frost-silvered roof tiles. Ink thickened in its pot. In the scholar's ward, a pale graduate wrote characters that would not settle. He stumbled at dawn to the city god's steps with a ribbon and a comb in his sleeve, tokens promised at a grave 3 years prior. At his mother's urging, he had sworn to wed a neighbor's daughter if she recovered. She died that winter, and since first frost, a woman's breath at his window had counted his heartbeats backward each night. Zhong Kui heard him out with a clerk's patience. Ghost marriage, amduyen, binds households by dread when promises are made in heat and kept in fear. He went to the grave with the scholar, carrying cords, seal, register, and a small brazier. He announced precinct, burial ground under city god's outer authority and King Yama's direct interest. He read the charge: unlawful enforcement of a vow upon the living, trespass by nightly siege, attempted kidnapping of breath. He set the brazier low and burned mugwort until smoke wrote curls against the stone. He placed Wu Daozi's portrait against the mound and steadied a water bowl before it. He laid the comb and ribbon on the grave as exhibits, not tribute. He required Oxhead and Horseface to stand back as silent witnesses. Their chains made no sound in frost. He spoke into the smoke, calling the dead girl by name, reciting lineage to honor and to bind. A shape rose, young and stubborn, wearing expectation like a bridal shawl. He praised the constancy, then waited. He wrote on the register, a ledger of costs paid by the living if the dead insist. An empty cradle, a mother unserved, a line bent out of its season. He offered terms that made mercy expensive to his own store. He opened his gourd and poured oil into the brazier, officer's coin, and promised a dowry of paper folded to the value of a modest marriage, to be burned under the city god's signature, if the girl would accept release and enter the registry of the unmarried dead with honor. He bound the promise with the iron seal, impressing it on the petition he would file at dusk. She asked, through the cold, for proof of respect. He set the demon-quelling sword's tip into the soil and cut a small doorway for words. He had the scholar read aloud a vow to care for the girl's mother on feast days and to set a place at the table at New Year, not for haunting, but for remembrance. He wrote that vow into the register, stamped it, and tied a cord around the scholar's wrist as reminder and bond. The shadow's breath unwound. The comb and ribbon warmed, then cooled to ordinary. He lifted the sword tip. The doorway closed with a click like ice settling. Black and White took the petition to the city god's hall. The steward signed, and the paper burned green at the edges, the sign of an agreement carried. The scholar slept that night with his window latch untested. Days later, he set a bowl and a cup at the family table and fed a mother not his own by law, but tied by a stamped line. The moral lay in debts paid cleanly. When vows cross the border between worlds, they must be rewritten in court and settled with measured gifts and living care. Thus ended exorcism number 18 out of 36. Ghost marriage dissolved, dowry burned under warrant, filial pledge recorded. Chapter 19. The market's soul thief. Wind out of the north stiffened banners. In West Market, customers staggered at stall edges and forgot in mid-barter what spice they sought. Children came home glass-eyed after chasing kites around the grain scales. A seller of lacquered combs collapsed with her hand still on the day's first coin. Traders muttered of via stolen, breath and luck skimmed by an unseen clerk. Zhong Kui entered at opening bell. He announced precinct and charge. Theft of market virtue by extraction of soul breath, interference with price by weakening memory, endangerment by crowd startle. He borrowed 4 bamboo poles and drew a square over the central crossroad with cords strung taut between, then pressed the iron seal into the cobbles at the square's heart. He hung from each side a strip of paper with the characters for weigh and witness. He laid a basin under Wu Daozi's portrait at the stall of the collapsed comb seller and stirred ash into the water until it turned the color of tea. He breathed on it and watched for bubbles. Where a breath had been skimmed, a bubble rose and failed to break. He mapped the path, from spice to ribbon to combs to scales and back, an hour's loop of theft. He rang the market bell once and declared a temporary court. Oxhead and Horseface took positions at opposite corners of the square. He invited stall-keepers into the square one by one and had each place the first coin they earned upon the seal. The coin chilled or warmed. When the comb seller's coin touched, it went cold as river metal in winter. The air thinned along the lane of scale makers. Soul thieves of the market, Kui Cho, often wear the shape of a helpful child or a gray aunt who always has the right string. He moved with the sword sheathed and the brush high. He wrote a character for come on the air between 2 stalls. The space puckered. A small figure with many sleeves showed, each sleeve lined with pockets to catch size. It reached for a scale to weigh what it called fairness. He named counts and threw the cord low. It dodged left. The cord met it right, because the seal taught the cord to anticipate greed. He tightened, pressed the iron stamp to its brow, and felt the twitch of a thing accustomed to crowds, unaccustomed to arrest. He required black and white to carry it along the stall row, making it witness each face it had blurred. With each recognition returned, the figure thinned. Sentence was made in terms merchants would understand. 7 market days turning scales true for free, posted as offender under warrant. Thereafter, bound to the city god's outer steps to blow dust from petitions instead of breath from mouths. He purchased, with his own gourd coin, the comb that had been first fallen and placed it in the seller's hand, recorded as evidence bought and returned. He wrote a rule into the ward ledger. The first coin of each day to be touched to a portrait-hung stall post for a breath, so luck would attach to witness before it could be stolen. The bell rang twice for reopening. Prices held steady, eyes cleared. The moral lay in the public repair of trust. Markets breathe when memory and measure are guarded like weights and ledgers. Thus ended exorcism number 19 out of 36. Market soul thief seized, recognitions restored, penance imposed in the square. Chapter 20. The wind that moved the charms. A dry gale scoured Chang'an. talismans posted after plague and festival lifted at their corners and ticked against wood. Some slid and hung crooked. A few leapt free and skittered down lanes like startled sparrows. In 3 wards, doorways that had been firm to petty things felt drafty with luck. Zhong Kui read the wind as a scribe reads a hurried hand. A wind demon works not by force but by cunning. It shifts warrants just enough that law seems present while standing a finger's breadth aside. He announced precinct and charge, interference with posted orders, counterfeiting of safety by displacement, assault upon the people's conduit. He began at the crossroads shrine. He hammered with black and white's iron nails 4 small plates, each stamped with his seal, into the shrine's posts, 1 to each side and height. He wrote on each plate a narrow clause. Talismans affixed within this frame take root under joint authority and cannot be moved by air without breaking law. He distributed plates to ward bailiffs, evidence, not amulets, so carpenters could mount them on household lintels beneath the portraits citywide. The gale thickened in alleys where portraits multiplied, a sign of resistance met. He walked into its throat, cords slung, sword at his back. He hung a fresh talisman under a plate and watched the paper try to flutter, then lie still as if it had grown a spine. In the next lane, he posted a charm without the plate. The wind took it sideways by a hair's breadth. The theft a craftsman's pride would spot and most would miss. He drew a square in dust and set the iron seal at its center. Dust lay flat within and churned outside. Wind gathered into a standing man-shape stitched of grit and silk thread. It bowed and tried the manners of a clerk. It pointed to the posted orders and offered to tidy them. He read the charges aloud so the air would carry them around corners. He cast a cord that moved like a clothesline in gale, slack then snapping tight. The shape slipped its shoulders and tried to lift the iron seal's shadow instead of its face. The seal's shadow weighed as its face does. It failed and hissed. He stepped to shift the frame so the plates caught the draft. Wind that had been wild went strummed and slowed, passing through law as through lattice. He struck once with the demon-quelling sword, not to split wind, but to cut its habit, across where fingers would be in a thief. Threads fell, grit lost in tension. He salted the square's center and stamped it, binding the remainder to the ground until Oxhead and Horseface shoveled it into a clay jar. He set sentence: 3 months in the city god's service, bound to bellows that stoke cremation fires and cannot wander. Afterward, to carry fumes away from sick rooms under watch. He returned along lanes where charms had hung crooked, refastening them under plates. He required ward bailiffs to keep 2 hammers and a box of stamped plates at the yamen door, to be lent freely and returned signed. He paid from his gourd a carpenter's day wage to teach neighbors how to set lintels true. The moral lay in fastening forms to substance. Warrants that take root cannot be argued out of place by clever weather. Thus ended exorcism number 20 out of 36, wind demon bound. Talismans refastened under stamped plates. Displacement halted. Chapter 21. The 9-tailed tutor mist rose from courtyard wells and dampened bamboo slips laid out to dry. In a private academy near the eastern ramparts, pupils recited while a new tutor traced characters that looked correct from across the room and wrong if one stood at his elbow. A boy's brush trembled. His eyes filmed. At dusk, 3 students walked home like sleepers and complained that ink smelled like sweet wine. Zhong Kui arrived at the 3rd watch by summons struck from a basin beneath a pasted portrait. He announced precinct and charge, unlawful pedagogy by unregistered spirit, enthrallment of minors, theft of learning breath. He laid his red register upon the headmaster's desk and weighed its top edge with the iron seal so that the school's ledger and his became one page. On first appearance, he set the thing's nature in place. Fox spirits age into cunning. After 1,000 seasons, their tales multiply, each a ledger of lives observed and tricks learned. A 9-tailed fox wears human habits with a scholar's neatness. It prefers roles that command attention without blows. Tutor, singer, doctor, feeding from gratitude made soft. He arranged instruments without ceremony. A clean bronze mirror angled to face a small copy of Wu Daozi's portrait. A water bowl stilled to paper. A ring of millet cast knee-high around the students' mats. Cords looped loose beneath the headmaster's chair. He bade the class write the character for upright. The boys obeyed. The tutor's hand paused a blink too long before the final stroke, as if negotiating with a rule. He addressed the tutor as one magistrate addresses another's impostor and asked for his name to be recorded. The air by the brazier fattened with perfume. He wrote 3 variants of fox: hill, city, river, and left a blank. The blank filled itself with a 4th: court. The tutor smiled with borrowed patience. The children's shadows leaned his way. He spoke charge and remedy. He required Oxhead and Horseface to stand outside the eaves where school becomes street. He cited his stacked remit: Nether Office for binding malefic spirits, Imperial Investiture to protect the living, Portrait Ward Conduit activating the basin's call, and the people's incense that made his reach swift under New Year's pact. The cords warmed along his forearm. He drew the demon-quelling sword to the length of a ruler and traced across the room a rectangle the size of an academy gate. Law defined the doorway. Anything leaving would pass under it named. He invited the tutor to step through. Its sleeve brushed the millet. Kernels clicked like teeth. It hesitated. He pressed the iron seal into the floorboards between desk and door. Wood learned weight. The shape shed courtesy. Tails showed in reflection, 9 fine lines in bronze, invisible to any eye not taught by the portrait's gaze. He cast the cord low to tangle ankles. Foxes hate restraint there. It tried charm through grammar, praising discipline and proposing compromise. He refused to bargain where minors were concerned. He cut, not flesh, but the filaments it had hung between sheets and minds. The boys blinked. Ink dried without scent. He stamped the brow once. The cleverness stung. He bound wrists meant to hold brushes, and with black and white impermanence, walked the fox past each pupil it had thinned, forcing it to watch names recover weight in the roll. Sentence was measured. 7 months of copying classic maxims in the 5th court for the use of the outer schools, tales bound in cords that tighten at lies. Thereafter, testimony in the city god's hall naming any households where it had taught under other names. He wrote a new rule into the academy ledger: mirrors to face portraits. First characters of each day to be written aloud and inspected under witness. Tutors to sign the ward book in human name and present to the city god's clerk at month's end. He left his gourd's oil and lamp fee on the headmaster's table as cost for using the people's conduit. The moral lay in the protection of learning. A city that guards its children's attention with law starves the oldest tricks. Thus ended exorcism number 21 out of 36. 9-tailed fox unmasked as tutor, bound, and sentenced to copywork under warrant. Chapter 22. Sickness in the color. Red dust sat on leaves like rust. In drought years, the city wore red. Thread knotted at latches, cinnabar smears on lintels, scarlet ribbons on infants' wrists. Then fever rose strongest where red clustered. Cloth dyers coughed. A midwife fainted beneath a red paper charm. A shrine boy's palms went hot from carrying a vermilion tablet. Zhong Kui walked the dyer's lane, eyes on vats the color of licked wounds. He announced precinct and charge. Contagion carried by tincture. Manipulation of ward colors into vectors. Contempt of ritual by inversion. When spirits learn fashions the way petty thieves learn patrols. Some ride pigments, tasting the fear that paints itself. He set basins at four corners of the lane and floated white willow leaves where red had been tied. On each he brushed a single character, cool. Where the sickness had nested, the leaf shivered in water that did not move. He mapped its square and drew a boundary on cobbles with the demon-quelling sword's sheathed tip, then pressed the iron seal into the center stone to root his order. He convened rather than chased. He hung a scarlet strip beneath a stamped metal plate, the kind now common on lintels after the wind case, and declared it seized evidence. Air thickened. Hooded shapes came, sleeves heavy with dye, their fingertips stained as if from pinched cinnabar. He read charges. He cited his layered remit and the portrait ward summons pasted at every dye shop door. Oxhead and Horseface stood with lidded jars. Black and White held salt. He offered terms. Disgorge heat into basins salted and sealed. Carry clear water under bailiff count to laundries for 7 nights. Unbind red threads from wrists and retie them to door latches where they ward households rather than choke small hands. Or be sealed and stacked until the rains. 2 tried a trick, leaping from ribbon to ribbon. The stamped plates halted the jump. Law gave the paper spine. He struck once with the drawn blade, cutting the custom, not the cloth, and the habit fell away like old dye and rinse. They screamed like kettles, then complied. He sealed the basins' mouths with paper impressed until paper remembered metal. He ordered dyers to boil their vats to the count of a bell and to add bitter weed to set color against spirit. He wrote into the ward record a change of practice. Red moved from bodies to thresholds. Infants' threads exchanged for plain flax. Cinnabar reserved for altars under witness. He paid from his gourd for a cask of clear water to be ladled freely at the lane's mouth, writing the expense beside his seal. By the 7th day, the heat line broke. Ribbon faded to sober shades. Wrists breathed. The moral lay in the humbling of symbol. When color becomes conduit, it must be unlearned and rehallowed in public sight. Thus ended exorcism number 22 out of 36. Red-born sickness convened, bound to labor, and purged from wards. Chapter 23. Silt that hid a river ghost. The way ran fat with late storms, brown as tea with too much leaf. Ferrymen spat and cursed a drag in the current that pulled oars sideways and made barges list along bars that charts denied. Downstream, wells near the bank drew water that left grit on the tongue and a sleep that felt like drowning. Zhong Kui answered at dusk. Tiger left high on the levee. He announced precinct and charge. Concealment within alluvial silt. Interference with transport. Poisoning of wells by seep. He placed on the ferry step a board burned with the emperor's order against blood sacrifice and weighed it with the iron seal. He set 3 basins, 1 filled straight from the river, 1 from a bank well, 1 with clear water brought in from uphill. Into each he sifted a palm of silt. He stirred with the sword sheath. In the 2 taken from the river's skin and the bank's throat, the silt climbed the water like smoke. He made a seine from cords, knots tied at measures a boatman knows, and stretched it between piles so that it bit the current without snagging men. He called Oxhead and Horseface to count. Black and White stood with jars to hold what could be held. He read the charge aloud, and cut a narrow furrow across the flow with the demon-quelling sword, not dividing water but making a channel where malice would try to run. The silt bulged. A back rose, broad, faceless, the color of churned bank, eyes where eddies gather. It reached with arms of mud for the well mouths up the slope. He stepped to change angle and used the seal's shadow as a pile. The seine caught, strained, then held. He shortened cord hand over hand, letting the current work its own capture. It tried to dissolve into more of itself. He salted the basins. Salt teaches water to speak separate from its burden. The clear water pan stayed honest. The river's mud heaved at the taste and clumped. He cast that clump into a jar and sealed it with a square of paper that learned iron. He read counts, ambush at hidden bars, theft of sleep at wells, contempt of posted prohibition. He set sentence: 7 flood nights chained to ferry piles, holding barges steady under bailiff count, then removal to the lower courts, where silt is pressed into bricks for kiln roads. The city god's river clerk stamped the notice. Boatmen shouted and leaned. Oars found true bite. He posted on the ferry post a rule: wells within 2 bowshots of the bank to be faced with stone and capped with stamped plates during flood. Opened only at 2 watches under witness. He paid from his gourd for lime to seal a village curb, writing the cost into his margin. By dawn, the current's trick was cured. Children drank and did not sleep against their will. The moral lay in the dredging of what hides in what seems ordinary. Brown water is not all one thing, and law can teach it to separate. Thus ended exorcism number 23 out of 36. River ghost dragged from silt, bound to piles, wells safeguarded. Chapter 24. Dispute at the temple of Sheneng heat lay flat over the vegetable fields outside the east gate. At the temple of Sheneng, farmer god, teacher of grains and herbs, 2 factions of unseen officials quarreled across the altar. Petitioners found prescriptions crossing themselves. Seed priests gave contrary days to sow. A plague ward hung crooked beside a grain charm and both went thin. Zhong Kui walked in under a trellis heavy with bitter gourd. He announced precinct and the nature of the quarrel. Jurisdictional trespass within an agricultural shrine. Commandeering of altar procedure by a minor harvest spirit puffed with offerings. Resistance from the city god's clerk, who read law but not furrow. He bowed to Shenong's image as officer to officer. He set his red register on the step and weighed it with the iron seal. He placed Wu Daozi's small portrait at the right pillar so the image's gaze would keep both sides from leaning too far. He called both parties to state claim. The harvest spirit, ripe-smelling, shoulders broad with brag, sickle at hip, argued for tribute and control of planting days as it remembered from a smaller county. The city god's clerk quoted closures and bell patterns that saved lives in the lanes, but wasted seedlings in the field. He read their statements into his book in neat counter columns and stamped both, not to approve, but to bind them to their words. He drew with the demon-quelling sword a rectangle inside which only evidence could be spoken. He set offerings in that square: a bowl of barley, a sheaf of millet, a jar of rainwater, a mortar of herbs labeled by a temple woman whose hands knew leaves. He summoned black and white to stand as mute bookends. He asked Shenong's priest to read the classic planting rhyme. Where the harvest spirit tried to interrupt, the iron seal warmed and the voice failed. Where the clerk tried to drag market law into furrow, the portrait's gaze made him swallow and begin again on the line about dew. He wrote judgment in 2 layers to mirror his stacked office. For living order, the city god's clerk would set bell patterns and market adjustments in plague only after this temple's priest declared sowing days. so hunger would not follow health. For spirit order, the harvest spirit would keep the altar free of plague wards and blood rumors and limit itself to seed and weather. In exchange, it would receive first incense on plowing day and carry petitions to the field shrines beyond the gate. He sealed both clauses. He assigned Oxhead and Horseface to witness the next 3 plantings, not to interfere, but to carry testimony in case of relapse. He ordered the crooked wards removed and burned, replacing them with a single stamped plate on the lintel declaring shared custody. Agriculture first within the temple, sickness first within the lanes, both bound at the gate by his seal. He paid from his gourd for water for the priest's mortar and for a pot of millet gruel ladled to those who had waited through the heat. The temple's air cooled. The altar top grew plain and clean. Farmers left with dates that agreed. The moral lay in ranking goods without breaking either. When gods share a field, the city eats. Thus ended exorcism number 24 out of 36. Jurisdiction set at Shennong's temple. Altar cleansed. Sowing days and health rules reconciled. Chapter 25. Revolt of the jailers. Night in Du had a furnace's breath. Chains cooled and warmed on their hooks. Ledgers sweated grease. The 5th Court's corridor smoked with lamp wicks burned to the nub. A clanging rose that was not duty but rhythm. The pacing of men who refused to take another step. Nether jailers, Onguch taught, stood with keys at their belts and arms folded, backs to the intake gate. New arrests from Chang'an, the lantern ghosts, the market thief, a river shadow clotted to brick, waited in a choking line while petition papers curled on the clerk's table. Zhong Kui descended by warrant, not by omen. He announced precinct and charge at the gate, mutiny in a court of judgment, refusal to receive lawfully bound offenders, endangerment of order by backlog, origin settled in a single glance. Jailers are not demons, but officers raised from shades with steady hands, sworn to keep the cold sheds from becoming rumor. Their revolt, if left, would split consequence from act. He set his iron seal upon the lintel so the gate would remember who spoke. He called Oxhead and Horseface to witness from the far end, chains looped. The jail captain, jaw like a meat axe, key ring heavy, spoke for the rank. Overfull cells, grease shortages, new rules from city courts that sent petitions to be stored with bodies, whispers that some arrests brought no lamp oil stipend. Grievance mixed with insolence, both carry heat. He laid his red register on a stone drum and wrote the complaint first. Law grows thin when it refuses to hear. He then read the counterweights. King Yama's investiture binding him to keep the living's arrests unbroken. The imperial recognition that gave him passage to enforce across the seam. The portrait ward conduit that made his summons swift and could only be honored if intake flowed. The people's incense that would be mocked if carriers of plague were held at a threshold to turn rot into boasting. He drew with the demon-quelling sword a square before the gate. Within it, speech must be oath. He called the ringleaders by name, naming each count. He cast cords low. The first man to step back found his ankles memory-tied to an older oath. He set the iron seal to the drum and spoke the order that costs. Return to duty under immediate audit. 3 foremost rebels to be chained for a day to the intake hook and lift what they had refused. Oil to be issued from his own gourd store for a week while ledgers were reconciled. The petition backlog to be sorted by black and white under his eye, not by rumor's hand. The captain measured him and found only steadiness. He lowered his head. Keys rattled once as if a cough had shaken them. Gates moved. Oxhead read out new arrivals. Horseface checked shackles. The line shortened as records became bodies and bodies entered place. He bound the three ringleaders without rage and posted their punishment on the drum. Duty as penance, penance as duty. He wrote a consolidation clause on the gatestone. By joint authority, intake could not be halted again without a petition signed by 3 courts above and below. He paid oil into the racks from his own gourd and wrote the expense in the margin where officers confess costs. By the 3rd watch, the corridor breathed a cooler air. The moral lay in service disciplined from within. Authority that hears grievance and binds it to labor keeps the law from kneeling to excuse. Thus ended exorcism number 25 out of 36. Nether jailers' mutiny quelled, intake restored, ringleaders bound to duty. Chapter 26. The wronged soul at the examination hall. Autumn thinned the light until it lay like paper across the examination hall. The roof brackets wore dust like old ink. Candidates moved with the hush of men counting their heartbeats. On the 2nd day, a cold passed down the rows, though no window stood open. A brush broke in a scholar's hand without force. Another wrote a fine line and watched it pale to nothing. At dusk, a moan climbed the pillars, thin as a reed flute played under water. Zhong Kui stepped through on the hall's petition, the small portrait above the side door making conduit as lawful as a clerk's summons. He announced precinct and charge. Haunting within the imperial examinations. Obstruction of merit. Attempt to bleed ink from answers. The city god's steward arrived bristling with procedures. The exam marshal stood stiff with insult. He weighed both with a look and set his iron seal upon the hall's master ledger so that all claims would be read into record. Origin came quietly. Wronged examination souls are thin as paper scraps born in corners. They return when a stroke of favoritism cuts across a line of learning. He cast millet along the central aisle, grains skittered to the right, as if an unseen sleeve brushed them. He set a clean bronze mirror where the chief examiner's chair looked. The mirror showed not a face, but a blank where a face should have been, as if a seat had been borrowed by a promise. He read aloud, in formal clauses, the charges against any shade present. Interference with state selection. Trespass upon the minds of examinees. Attempted theft of rank by despair-made malice. A cold thickened beside the north pillar. He pressed the iron seal to the pillar's base. A figure drew out of the wood. A young man with scholar's knots and a rope's memory around his neck. He did not rail. He bowed with the bitterness of a line crossed through. Zhong Kui recited his own history in a single even sentence. Rejection for the face, not the hand, and made of it a plank, not a banner. He offered the path of repair, not flattery. Testimony taken into the hall book. A petition written under his seal requesting a posthumous acknowledgement from the Ministry of Rights. Recopying of the ghost's answers from memory into the nether ledger under black and white's eyes. Removal of his claim from this year's candidate's nerves. The shade asked for fairness, not favor. He bound the promise with the iron seal impressed upon a sheet of paper that would travel with Oxhead to the city god's dais, and thence by clerk to the palace. He then drew the demon-quelling sword a handspan and cut the thin threads that had looped from shade to brush tips, naming the charge as he severed, obstruction of living merit. Ink darkened. The broken brush wrote again as if a joint had been set. He required the exam marshal to read new procedure into the ledger, the first line of each paper to be written under the gaze of a portrait. The mirror kept facing the examiner's chair, not the men. The hall's night watch to pace with basin and willow leaf, not with laments. He stood outside while the candidates finished the watch in steadier air. By dusk, a sealed petition moved toward the palace. The ghost followed Oxhead as witness, not as prisoner. The moral lay in the distinction drawn clean. Justice honors the wronged without stealing breath from the hopeful. Thus ended exorcism number 26 out of 36. Examination hall ghost bound to testimony. Ink restored. Petition for redress filed. Chapter 27. The mirror that showed the true. The wind came cold off the ramparts and hammered silver into puddles. In the ward of healers, a physician's house drew crowds. He placed hands that cooled fevers and left cheeks pale with a moth's dust. Children slept after a dose and woke thinner. A widow swore her cough climbed into the doctor's palm. He smiled from behind a red lamp. Zhong Kui arrived with the small portrait hung under the eaves so the conduit would note the summons. He announced precinct and charge, imposture of healing, extraction of vitality under guise of cure, trading upon fear. He asked for the neighborhood's temple mirror, a relic kept wrapped in cloth, a Zhao illumination glass said to show what words hide when properly ordered. He set it upon a tripod and angled it to face Wu Daozi's painted eyes. He steadied a bowl beside it until the water lay like paper. On first sight, the doctor was careful. Origin hid in manner, not in mouth. Corpse things that learn medicine favor warm rooms and red-washed light. They pass themselves off by rote pulse counts and phrases that slide like oil. He required the doctor to stir a patient's potion where mirror and portrait could look. He wrote the character for truth upon the bowl's surface with a dry brush. The ink sank without stain. He pressed the iron seal to the mirror's back and awakened its honest habit. The reflection blistered around the doctor's fingers. Nails lengthened into the gray of old bone. A second mouth yawned at the wrist to sip breath unseen. He read the counts. Malefic consumption. Counterfeit of remedy. Endangerment of minors. He cast the cord low. Such things hate ankle fetters because ankles remember the grave's posture. It tried courteous speech. The fee returned, the promise to leave, offered through a practiced tone. He refused to bargain with what had fed upon the small. He drew the demon-quelling sword and cut the ribbon of red light that made the house taste like safety. The room chilled to honest wood. Black and white impermanence stepped forward. He stamped the thing upon the brow. It shivered and bent until both mouths closed. He set sentence with precision. 7 months binding herbs in the 5th court for mourners, where flavor heals grief, not flesh. After, testimony in the city, God's hall naming the houses where he had set lamps and the names of those who taught him doctor's words. He wrote a rule into the ward record. Mirrors to face red-lamped rooms. Children treated with a basin at the threshold, so breath cannot slip uncounted. Fees recorded aloud and stamped on the stall post under portrait gaze. He paid from his gourd for a jar of real ginger to be boiled for the widow, and left oil for the lamp at the temple steps. The moral lay in exposure that saves rather than shames. Truth made public turns a predator's room into a place for breath to return. Thus ended exorcism number 27 out of 36. False physician unmasked by truth mirror, bound, ward protocols posted. Chapter 28. Pieces in the waste ground. Beyond the north gate, a stretch of bony ground lay where carts shed broken handles and boys cracked tiles for sport. Dog packs nosed old fires. Reeds grew around a ditch where rain remembered itself. At dusk, carriers swore pieces crept. A hand closing on a sandal, a knee bone tipping a jar, a pale ear listening above dry grass. A single body does mischief in a line. A parted one sows panic. Zhong Kui went out with cords coiled and the iron seal heavy at his belt. He announced precinct and charge. malefic division to avoid arrest, creeping trespass upon the living, conspiracy of scattered parts. The city god's patrol showed him the ditch where children would not play. The wind carried a smell like wetted ash. He set 4 cords in a square, stakes pressed with the iron seal so the lines would hold even if pulled from beneath. He placed a basin at each corner and salted each mouth. He wrote on the dirt with the sheathed sword a character for gather and a second for yield. He stood at the square's center and struck the scabbard once. The ground twitched. A foot dragged itself from weed to dust. A hand followed, then a jaw that could not speak because the tongue lay elsewhere. This was a demon that had chosen to live by division. Its harm small but many, its fear dispersed. He called Oxhead and Horseface to witness at 2 corners. Black and White took the other posts, lids off their jars. He read the charge and the penalty if it did not submit. Reconstitution by force under irons and judgment thereafter, or convening under warrant, naming of hidden pieces, and sentencing to labors that require wholeness. He cast a cord. It looped around 3 parts at once and tightened as if memory threaded bone. The jaw snapped. The foot kicked. The hand scrabbled for ditch slime. He stepped precisely and cut, not flesh, but the trick by which parts ignored each other's pain. The cords learned weight from the seal. The parts remembered belonging. They slid toward one another as filings toward a magnet. He stamped the center with the iron seal and the square held. In the mirror of a basin, he saw the missing eye rolling along a rut toward a cart. He wrote its name upon the water, and the eye turned aside, compelled by the written road. When all lay within the square, he allowed the thing to knit enough to hear. He set sentence. 7 fortnights turning millstones in the 5th court without relief, so it would learn the weight of staying assembled. Then public testimony naming the field where a greater thing had taught it, the division trick. He carried the bound mass in chains, not for show, but for teaching, and the boys at the wall watched without daring to throw shards. He posted a rule at the gate. Waste ground to be crossed with basin and willow leaf on days of wind, and boys to be kept from the ditch at dusk. Broken jars and tile to be gathered and buried under stamped plate so edges do not teach malice to crawl. The moral lay in a city's insistence on integration. Harm multiplied by dismemberment is cured by forcing parts to carry their weight together. Thus ended exorcism number 28 out of 36. Divided demon convened, bound, and sentenced to whole labor. Chapter 29. A wedding under red lamps. Rain found the roofs and made the brothel lanes smell of rouge and old wood. Red lamps swung like small planets. Music drifted that made young men remember themselves brighter than they were. In a back court, a wedding pavilion had been dressed with silks and a chair with phoenix arms. A groom in scholar's hat stood with steps too shallow for joy. The bride's veil hung heavy as if soaked, though the rain had not reached it. Zhong Kui entered on the strike of a basin from an upstairs sill where a paste portrait looked out. He announced precinct and charge. Unlawful marriage contracted between living and malefic. Entrapment under ritual forms. Abduction of lineage by red lamp rites. The madam came with practiced bows. The officiant smiled with teeth even as fish scales. Girls peered from lattices, bracelets quiet. Origin made itself known in the veil's weight. Lamp wedding tricks feed on men who think themselves exceptions. A river thing had borrowed a bride's outline to wed a breathing lineage to a red-water household. He set the iron seal upon the pavilion's threshold. The wood sobered from crimson to brown. He placed Wu Daozi's small portrait on the gift table so the painted gaze would rest where vows were meant to land. He read the charges aloud. He required the officiant to state name and office. It tried a city clerk's diction. The words came out with gill sounds. He cast a cord low around the chair's legs where foxes and river things like to tether their stage. He drew the demon-quelling sword and cut the silk loop that made the pavilion look like temple space. The music stumbled into honest noise. He lifted the veil with the flat of the blade. Water ran from cloth that had not been wet. The face beneath was a poor mimicry of blush and breath. He stamped the brow. The gills opened and shut like fans without hands. He announced sentence at once. The officiant bound in irons to testify in the city god's hall to the den that trained it. The bride shape dissolved. The red lamps doused and their wicks pinched under watch. The house fined by lamp oil paid into ward shrines for the nights of deceit. He turned to the living groom and read his count without softness. Intent to contract a ritual without witness of kin, contempt of proper courtship, affront to his own line. He did not bind him, he bound his vow. He made him write under the portrait's eyes a promise to serve his parents 7 feast days without wine and to return the bride price to his own household stores. The promise took ink only after the seal had pressed it. He posted a rule at the ward yamen. Red lamp houses may not stage wedding rites. Any bride chairs within must be broken and remade as benches for the poor at the city god's steps. He paid oil into the shrines and left, the rain cooling the silk to map quiet. The moral lay in protecting vows from stagecraft. Ritual gains its weight when it cannot be bought by lamp. Thus ended exorcism number 29 out of 36. Red lamp wedding halted. River impostor bound. Ward ban on brothel marriages posted. Chapter 30. Sending back the stolen skull. Wind from the plateau smelled of loess and old bone. In the potter's ward, a boy kicked a jar and a skull rolled out, teeth clicking like abacus beads. Night thereafter brought knockings from under beds and a whisper at altars to call the wrong names. Someone had been stealing heads from charnel shelves to sell as medicine bowls and talismans. The houses who had lost them could not quiet. Zhong Kui came at first watch with cords coiled and the iron seal warm. He announced precinct and charge. Theft of skulls from ossuaries. Disruption of ancestral rest. Trade in parts that carry names. He set 4 tables in the yamen court and laid skulls upon them, each on a circle of paper. He brushed a character at each crown, return, and pressed the iron seal until the paper learned weight. The room changed. A hush like a hand lay on the air. He called black and white impermanence to hold the ledger. Oxhead and Horseface stood by the gate. He bade the city god's steward bring the ossuary lists and read the names of the unquiet. Where name and bone were estranged, the basin's water clouded. Where matched, the water cleared. He traced routes on the ground with the sword sheath. The way the jars had traveled from charnel shelf to market stall to potter's yard. He followed one thread to a stall where a charm seller offered ancestor bowls. The man's eyes slid past the portrait pasted behind him. Zhong Kui read the counts and bound his wrists with light irons, for the offense was grave though the man had not cut a throat himself. He stamped the stall post and declared it impounded. He used the portrait's conduit to step 3 thresholds and found another jar under a sleeping bench, sealed with red string tied in a knot used for wedding charms. The knot made the theft worse. He returned to the court and began the work of sending back. He set each skull at the compass point of its home ward. He wrote the name again where it matched. Where the name was forgotten, he wrote lineage if found. Where even that failed, he wrote the character for empty and promised to fill it when a living relative came. He lifted each skull with both hands, as one lifts a title deed, and pressed the iron seal to the brow. The bone warmed with a memory of skin and acknowledged the stamp. He sent Oxhead with 2 on a litter to the temple of their line. He sent Horseface with others to charnel shelves under stamped plates. He carried one himself to a house where a widow stood with hair unbound. He set sentence for the seller. 7 months cleaning the charnel houses, learning names until they outweighed coin. Thereafter, to sit under the city god's steps and recite the list of the unclaimed at dusk so living ears might remember. He wrote a rule into the ward ledger, jars to be marked with stamped slips naming ward and family, skull shelves to be faced with the new plates that bind talismans to law, bone trade forbidden except for proper burial under witness. He paid from his gourd for a kiln firing to make plain jars for the returned, each marked with a stamped character for home. The knocking under beds ceased by the next moonrise. Altars accepted the rice without whisper. The moral lay in the repair of names. When a city returns, faces to their shelves, its sleep thickens and holds. Thus ended exorcism number 30 out of 36. Stolen skulls identified, sealed, and returned. Bone trader bound to charnel service. Chapter 31. Ferries passed the river Lord. A hard rain trimmed the river white. The ferry steps smoked with spray. Boatmen spat into their palms and saw the spit leap away as if snatched. Midstream, 3 grain barges yawed under a pull that was not current. Poles bowed. Children on the bank coughed river air and swayed as if their ribs were oars. Zhong Kui set his tiger high on the levee where hooves slip and men stare upward for steadiness. He announced precinct and charge. Unlawful seizure of boats under imperial levy, extortion by threat of capsize, interference with ferries during flood. He placed on the lowest stone a board burned with the emperor's prohibition against blood bargain, and weighed it with the iron seal until the step remembered the weight of law. Origin needs stating only once each season. Riverlords, Ha-Ba, hold memory of tribute older than codes. When waters run fat, they test whether men remember fear. He uncoiled cords and tied them not to posts, which rot, but to stamped plates hammered into stone where the seal's shadow could teach iron to hold. He stretched a seine across the narrow where piles bit shallow, knots measured to a boatman's span. Oxhead and Horseface stood as witnesses on either abutment. Black and White kept jars open to catch what could be made to clump from water. He read charges with the demon-quelling sword held low, edge unseen, and drew through the rain a narrow legal gate. Any river being passing would pass named. The water shouldered up in a flank like a dragged ox, horns rose, eyes rolled blank as silt. A voice like bucket echo demanded old coin and a boy. He cited his stack in order, so the river would understand he had not come as a petitioner. Nether investiture from King Yama granting right to bind malefic spirits that trouble the living. Imperial passage from Xuanzong's dream authorizing protection of levee and road. Portrait ward conduit by which every pasted likeness along the bank made each stair a door he could lawfully step through. The people's incense that braided his reach and made his presence heavier where basins had been struck. The Seine took the first heave. Cords learned stubbornness from the seal in his hand. He stepped aside to change the angle, letting the pull waste itself against stone. He cut once with the drawn blade at the knee of the current, not at the crown, so water stumbled and did not rage. Barges drifted from the mouth of a hidden draw and found the honest channel by the feel of their own drafts. He set sentence in public hearing over rain. 7 flood nights the river lord bound to the piles by irons hammered thin for wet labor, holding barges steady under bailiff count. 3 market days seated in plain sight at the ferry steps while children crossed dry without ransom. After, removal of the hidden draw under his own hand, with silt piled into bricks for the levee road. He pressed the iron seal to one antler base, the head lowered as if a yoke had been laid. Boatmen hauled. Women on the bank emptied their lungs and found them returned. The grain barges kissed the piles, then slid past, oars taking bites of water that did not slip. He posted a rule on the ferry post: ropes to be tied to stamped plates, not to stakes. Flood crossings by warrant only. Basins kept at stairs for quick summons under the portrait's gaze. He paid lime and a mason's wage from his gourd to harden a weak step and wrote the cost into his margin. The moral lay in turning depth into service. A river that remembers law holds rather than steals. Thus ended exorcism number 31 out of 36. Barges freed. River lord bound to piles and compelled to service. Chapter 32. Hungry ghosts in the grain. The drought's throat still rasped. The south granary's shutters clicked as if teeth chattered within. Night watchmen counted breaths and lost count. Sacks sweated. Rats kept distance from a cool that was not mercy. At dawn, a boy lifting a measure cup saw steam in a sunless aisle and ran. Word came with a grain smell that was not bread. Zhong Kui walked the long corridor between stacked millet. He announced precinct and charge. Hungry ghosts raiding public stores. Theft of ration from poor bellies. Conspiracy and darkness against ward order. He weighed the granary steward's ledger with the iron seal so ration lists would speak with two courts' tongues. He set 4 basins in a square and salted each mouth. He brushed on their surfaces the character for enough and watched where the ink sank. The air thickened near the oldest wall, where names of donors had been scratched to pale. Hungry ghosts, qui joy, cling to neglect. They drink steam that rises from human food and leave crumbs that breed quarrel. He drew with the sheathed sword a narrow rectangle and declared it a receiving dock for the dead under warrant. He rang the bell once and called black and white impermanents to stand like doorposts. He read charges aloud and offered terms that would feed the living first. Disgorge stolen steam into salted basins, then carry 30 sacks under ox heads count to kitchens for orphans and kiln workers. After 7 nights, sit at the city god's steps to read the donors' names while the steward lays new plaques so a blank wall does not teach hunger. If they refused, he would bind and stack them in the 5th court's cold sheds until harvest. A hiss moved along the aisle like someone blowing to cool porridge. He cast cords low. They tightened on ankles thin as broom straw. He stamped the iron seal and the cords learned to weigh shame. Gray mouths opened like candle cups. Steam curled out and lay upon the salted waters, which darkened as if tea had been poured. He tasted none of it. Officers do not eat what they forbid. He sent ox head and horse face ahead with sacks. The ghosts labored in lines, wrists bound by courtesy and cord. He posted a rule: first ladles for kitchens sworn to widows and orphans. The donors' names recarved and read aloud monthly. Wardens to keep 2 basins salted beneath the portrait so steam cannot collect uncounted. He paid from his gourd for brush and plank to make the new plaques, and for a kettle to boil millet at the steps on reading nights. By the 8th morning, the granary smelled only of grain. Quarrels at the queue thinned. The moral lay in the restoration of names and measures. When stores remember their givers and their hungry, ghosts have less to drink. Thus ended exorcism number 32 out of 36. Hungry ghosts convened, disgorged, and bound to labor. Donor wall restored, Uptidin. 33. Binding the hanging bridge mist pulled in strips across the northern ravine. A rope and plank bridge hung from jawed posts, its belly lower than pride admits. Mule bells balked at midspan. Traders crossed with hands wide and eyes narrow. Twice in a month, a shoe had fallen without a foot. Under the boards, something counted. Zhong Kui climbed at dawn when wind hisses like a saw through cedar. He announced precinct and charge. Predation at a public crossing. Unlicensed toll-taker beneath a warded span. Shaking of timbers to harvest fear. He traced the bridge's old wards with his thumb and found characters thin as smoke. He hammered stamped plates into each jawed post so the bridge would carry law in iron as well as ink. He set cords down the span at knee, wrist, and shoulder height, knotting them through the plates so the lines learned to sing if touched. He suspended a basin under the midpoint with a 3-strand rope and steadied its surface with a pinch of ash. He pressed the iron seal to the chief plank until the wood took a square shadow. Boxhead and horseface posted at both ends. Black and white moved along the foot planks like quiet carp. He read the charge aloud, facing the drop. The thing moved. A long, jointed pail that lay against undersides and tapped until steps shortened and fear lengthened. He named counts: extortion by sway, theft of surety, conspiracy with rot. He drew the demon-quelling sword and cut the habit, not the rope. A downward slice through air where fingers had learned to pluck. The bridge stopped humming. The basin's surface bubbled where breath tried to enter. He salted it, and the bubbles died square. He cast a cord beneath and snagged a joint. The cord heated along his forearm, eager to recoil. He fed it more line until the joint could surface. It came up like a rib bleached smooth by river. He stamped it. The bone learned to lie still. He hauled 3 more lengths and laid them on planks under plates until the set lay like a broken centipede. Sentence took the local road. 7 months pinned at the posts as guardrails for children on festival days. 3 storms carrying stones to the footings under bailiff count. After, removal to the 5th Court's builders to be pressed into pegs that cannot shimmy. He posted a new ward at each jaw, a stamped plate, an inked character, a bell made of a spoon to tell wind from hands. He paid a carpenter's wage from his gourd to set the planks that had learned to give at the wrong sound. Traders crossed with strides that lengthened. Mules shook and then settled. The moral lay in the marriage of craft and writ. Bridges hold when iron remembers what ink teaches. Thus ended exorcism number 33 out of 36. Ravine predator hauled and pinned. Bridge rewarded with stamped plates. Chapter 34. Borrowing a body to repay, a debt frost penciled the eaves. A brazier in the potter's ward cracked and spit a coal onto a mat. Fire took a step and waited for panic to give it speed. A widow who kept 3 jars and 1 child hauled water and found her bucket lighter than her fear. She had once fed a dying conscript with her last millet. He had died in the spring after thanking no one. Now a thumb tapped her window, not with malice but with a soldier's request to enter the gate he had not honored. Zhong Kui arrived on the basin's stillness and the portrait's gaze. He announced precinct and charge, and then the petition. A shade sought to borrow a living body to repay a debt by deed, not by haunting. The debt was simple: carry water, lift jars, smother flame. He set the iron seal upon the threshold and declared the doorway a court. He called black and white to witness and bound his own compassion into the register so it would not soften the edges due to law. He recited the rule that keeps mercy from turning into theft. No possession without petition. No act beyond the stated need. No use of voice or vow. Return upon the 3rd bell or earlier. cost to be borne by the officer who stamps the writ. He wrote the widow's son's name, left a space, pressed the seal, and felt the paper warm where consent settled. He asked the mother for a nod, and took it as binding when made before the portrait. He drew the demon-quelling sword a hand's breadth to open a slit between breath and will, just wide enough to admit one debt. He bound a cord around the boy's wrist and tied the other end to the iron seal so the line would run through law. The shade entered like a man refusing wine, briefly, steadily, without flourish. The boy's arms took weight. The bucket lifted. The coal hissed out. The jars moved to safety. He counted aloud, not for drama but for limit. On the third bell, he pressed the iron seal to the boy's brow, closed the slit, and tugged the cord. The shade stepped back and saluted without hand, the gesture crisp in frost. He wrote its name into the nether ledger as debtor paid, and assigned it to carry letters in the Fifth Court for a month, so tidings would travel as promises kept. He paid oil from his gourd into the widow's lamp as cost. He wrote the expense into his margin. He posted a rule into the ward record. In fires called by basin, a borrowing may be granted under writ for acts of rescue only, with witnesses present and cords tied to seal. No other errands accepted. The moral lay in mercy written down. Gratitude that walks through a living body must do so under weight and within time. Thus ended exorcism number 34 out of 36. Lawful body borrowing granted and closed. Debt recorded. Fire quelled. Chapter 35. Dispute at the imperial plowing. The first furrow of spring is a line that teaches the rest. At the Tichjian field outside the east gate, the furrow waited for the emperor's hand on the plow. Drums measured a careful joy. Shennong's banner breathed. The city god's clerk held scrolls. Seed priests carried bowls. Farmers lined the verge as if standing in a temple nave. Then the air leaned. Two unseen offices stepped upon the field at once. Zhong Kui stood where furrow meets road and announced precinct and quarrel. Distribution of the first blessing, Loka, argued between the field's ancient steward and the city's magistrate of streets. Claims crossed the altar and tripped hands. He set his red register on a plinth and weighed it with the iron seal. He placed Wu Daozi's small portrait at the edge of the furrow so image and ordnance would face the first cut. He called both parties to speak their claim under the demon-quelling sword's shadow, which he held level like a beam. The field's steward, earth-scented, straw in hair, demanded first incense and control of offerings for weather and worms. The city god's clerk argued for closures, market hours, and plague rules that had saved wards in drought. He wrote both in counter columns and stamped them so neither could wriggle later and call it memory. He drew a rectangle within which only seed and law could be named. He set Shennong's priest to read the rhyme for sowing. He had the emperor's steward speak the ritual clause for plowing. He cited his stacked remit. Nether seal to bind spirits that meddle with the living's labor. Imperial passage to guard state rights. Portrait. Ward conduit to answer any household basin struck during the ceremony. People's incense braided through doors that made his presence heavy in seasons of planting. He judged as one binds two oxen to a single yoke without breaking necks. The first blessing of the furrow would fall to the field's steward and Shennong's house, all offerings of grain and dew first to agriculture. The first cooked rice ladled at the edge would be the city gods to distribute to wards under health rules. Bell patterns and market adjustments would be declared only after the priest set sowing days. He sealed both clauses and set Oxhead and Horseface as witnesses for the first 3 cuttings. The emperor took the plow and broke the field. Soil curled like a page turned. Farmers shouted once and then grew quiet as seed took air. He posted a plate at the gate. Within the Tikjian precinct, agriculture first. At the city's edge, health first. Both tied by seal at the road between. He paid from his gourd for gruel to be ladled to widows and ditch diggers at the field's rim and wrote the cost down. The moral lay in ordered generosity. When blessings are yoked to places, they fatten both bowls and streets. Thus ended exorcism number 35 out of 36. First furrow blessing apportioned, rites reconciled, joint plate posted at the field gate. Chapter 36. The general writ for all thresholds. Winter walked in with knives of air. Doors tightened their ropes. Portraits yellowed at the corners and were replaced. Basins found the stillness that means readiness. From Dieu's court, a scroll came up borne by black and white impermanence. From the palace, a lacquer tube came with a red cord and a steward's seal. King Yama's writ named a consolidation. The emperor's edict named a mandate. The city waited not for spectacle, but for order spoken clearly. Zhong Kui stood under the East Market portico, where Wu Daozi's great painting watched the thinning crowds. He announced precinct, Chang'an and all its wards, and the scope, a general command for the quelling of demons and the keeping of thresholds through winter and through years. He laid both scrolls side by side and set the iron seal upon them until lacquer and hell ink learned one temperature. He read first the nether writ. Confirmation of the office of ghost quelling with explicit extension to any malefic spirit that touches trade, hearth, or right within the emperor's peace. Right to bind by red register and iron seal. Authority to conscript nether officials as witnesses in living courts. He read the imperial edict. Recognition that the portrait ward, once hung in a household or gatehouse, constitutes a standing summons bearing the court's acknowledgement. Rite of passage between yamen, shrine, and door where basins are struck. Expectation that wardens will keep stamped plates for talismans and mirrors. He then spoke the people's clause that had grown from practice into rule. Door god veneration, standing as the city's broadest conduit, strength scaled by incense and season, whereby households that paste the image and keep the basin gain swift notice and share in the net that gathers shallow harms before they harden. He posted schedules for ward bell patterns in plague, rules for lantern lowering after festivals, market mirror inspections, and river plates at stairs. He assigned ox head and horse face to carry copies to outer gates and ferries, black and white to temples and schools. He paid from his gourd for oil to keep the portrait lamps at the great gates lit through the long nights, and wrote the cost into his margin. He tied a cord from the portico post to his own seal and left it there for a watch so the city could feel the tug that means the net holds. The moral lay in making a city's courage procedural. Courage that can be posted, stamped, and taught will outlast a single winter. Thus ended exorcism number 36 out of 36, nether writ and imperial edict joined, citywide guardianship ordered for all thresholds. In later years, the streets remembered his tread without dread. Basins stood quiet until struck. Cords hung coiled beside lintels that had learned to bear weight. Portraits watched and did not tire. He answered fewer great cases because smaller harms were caught in nets he had taught the city to weave. Winter lamps held steady, spring plows cut clean. Behind doors, children slept in air kept honest by ink, iron, and the patience of neighbors. At gates, papers yellowed and were made new, hands steady on pastebrush and plate nail. In alleys, cats hunted rats and not fear. On river steps, Ropes sang with a lawful hum. The households he kept learned to keep themselves and one another, and his office, layered by judgment, edict, portrait, and incense, endured. And that's it. Our journey with Zhong Kui is complete. We've gone through every case I could find and carried them into English, so his legend stands here in full. Did you enjoy the rhymes along the way? They were my way of keeping the tale alive where few English versions exist. If you did, hit subscribe and ring the bell. Next, I'll try to finish Journey to the West. Drop your favorite case in the comments. See you in the next chapter of Journey to the West.